for.
Well, thank you for talking to me this morning. I must get away because we want to go up to Birmingham now to New Street Station and Tom Coyne.
This shopping precinct in which I'm standing is part of the Birmingham New Street Station, and with me are a whole load of commuters on their way to work.
Yes.
How do you feel about the way this election has gone?
Absolutely shocked beyond reason that they can possibly have got in. I've stayed up most of the night and I just can't believe it's true.
What are you particularly disappointed about? What worries you about a Labour victory?
Most of all the nationalisation, I think. I'm frightened to death that everything's going to be taken over and we just won't be able to do anything for ourselves.
How do you feel about it?
Very strongly about a Labour victory for the simple reason I dislike Labour, I dislike their policies and nationalisation of course, and also there's a lot too many in the Labour government that are left-wing, and I think this thing is just going to ruin the country, and I just don't see how people can vote Labour and understand it's going to be good for the country.
Is there anyone here who's happy about the Labour victors coming?
This quite happy. I think this is going to be a moderate government. It really means that this is what the election wanted, a sort of a coalition, because government will have to be moderate.
What about you, sir? How do you feel about the way things have gone?
Well, I'm very disappointed at the fact that it's another stalemate. I come from Wolverhampton South West, and I'm a Conservative.
That's the old Enoch Powell constituency, isn't it? The former one. Yes.
I would have liked a decision one way or the other, but preferably a Conservative. But nevertheless, I don't like to think that we're going to be controlled by left-wing communists in the trade unions.
Yes. We have a Liberal here. You must be feeling a bit disappointed at the moment.
Really.
What did you expect from this election?
Well, I was hoping that we would have a greater Liberal vote this time. Far more people having the courage to think for themselves and decide on the Liberal candidate as being the only alternative to the two-party system.
Well, look, we've got all your housewives here, and of course inflation has been very much in the news. What do you want from a government at the moment? What are you hoping for?
Food prices to come down.
Do you think that's likely to happen?
No, not with Labour.
Is there anybody here who didn't bother to vote at all? Or did you all go to the polls? Because it has been a low poll. Anybody who didn't go at all? No? How do you feel, sir? Can you tell me how you feel about the election as it's going at the moment?
Well, I'm very sorry that any party has an overall majority, because I think with a minority government it prevents any party from getting over too radical a view. And I'm also very disappointed that a party, namely the Liberals, that can get 5 or 6 million votes, turn up with 10 to 14 seats at each election.
What do you think about the opinion polls and the fact that they were so off the mark again?
Well, I think we just don't pay any attention to them in future at all.
Is there anyone here who is more interested in local issues rather than national issues?
Well, no. We are industrial Midlands, and it can be either government would serve a useful purpose. But I would like to comment on the fact that I think the Conservatives have not done so well because Mr. Heath is not as dynamic as he should be. And I do think that despite Enoch Powell's statement about voting Labour at the last election, I think he'll come back.
All right, thank you very much indeed as we return to Mike Barrett in London.
Thank you, Tom Coyne. In Birmingham, and just to quickly remind you, behind me are the state of the parties at the moment, with Labour on 294, Conservatives 185, 5 Liberals and 9 others, and repeating yet again that Labour must be that much ahead at this time on a Friday morning because there are many safe Conservative seats to come in. David, very quickly though, what about some of these seats that are Labour gains already?
Well, here is the list. The first one is the first one that came in, and that, of course, is Dick Taverne out, and that really makes a difference. After that, you have a whole series of seats that were just the most marginal seats. The swing was very uniform in the marginal seats. All those were subject to a swing of 2% or less, except, I think, Birmingham Selly Oak. Peterborough, the super marginal, has gone firmly into Labour camp to Michael Ward at the 4th attempt. And here you have the last one of all, Blythe, where we just saw Eddie Mill now explaining it. Berwick and East Lothian's worth noting. It's the one seat the Conservatives gained in February. They've lost it again. John McIntosh, a very fervent pro-market Labour MP, is back, defeating the Earl of Ancram.
Well, no doubt there's some jubilation at Labour Party headquarters this morning as they look at those kind of figures, but perhaps it's rather muted in view of this very slender majority they have. Let's hear, though, from the very headquarters itself.
As this place was
Graves
on the move until well after 4 o'clock this morning, it's hardly surprising that anyone with any sense is still in bed.
The mood when people went home about 4 o'clock was a rather flat one. The evening had started in sharp contrast to the February election, with everyone confident of a very big Labour victory here. I think Mr Wilson had been speaking to them earlier in the day, and he'd forecast that to the workers here in private. And then came, of course, the straw polls, which also forecast a large Labour victory. But about 2 or 3 o'clock this morning, when the situation wasn't all that clear, there was a strange flatness descended here, and Transport House people who had earlier in the evening been forecasting a big victory and talking of victory were no longer speaking on those terms. Perhaps we shall get some clearer indication of what the situation is when the party officials start arriving shortly. Mr Wilson is expected here about lunchtime, and hopefully we'll be able to speak to him as well. But for now, this is Keith Graves at Transport House.
Keith, now let's just nip straight across to Conservative Party headquarters, where there's certainly not jubilation this morning. What is there, Martin Bell?
I hear nothing.
I fear we have lost sound there. Let's try once more for one other party headquarters, the Liberal Party. Richard Wakely is there. See if we can call him up. Richard Wakely, can you hear me?
Well, of course, it's been a disappointing night here for the Liberals who've been watching the election at the National Liberal Club here in London. When polls closed at 10 last night, their hopes were high. In the last Parliament, they'd had 15 MPs, and they'd polled over 6 million votes. This election, they were fielding over 100 more candidates than last time, and they were expecting their vote to rise in proportion. In fact, they'd earmarked no less than 65 seats, which they saw as having possible openings for new Liberal successes. Instead, they've seen their vote fall, and 1 or 2 of their seats fall too. On the whole, they blame the low turnout for this. But though they're disappointed, they're not too disappointed. They're still reckoning on a dozen or so MPs, and if the Labour majority turns out to be as small as predicted, they're looking forward to eating it away at the first available by-election. Perhaps their one big remaining worry is that their total vote will not be large enough for them to continue their pressure for a new voting system. Their eyes are still set hungry on that promised land of proportional representation and the 60 or so seats that they might win then. In the meantime, however, they're a bit sad, but they're not defeatist. Richard Wakely on the balcony of the National Liberal Club, London.
Well, I gather we may have sorted out our sign problems over at Conservative Party headquarters, so let's try again with Martin Bell.
Well, I'm sorry about that. What we were trying to tell you was there's been no popping of champagne corks here, of course. What there have been is a lot of rather glum-faced Conservatives pointing out that things could have been a great deal worse. They're disappointed, of course they are, but the defeat had none of the shock of last February's. They're taking it philosophically, indeed they haven't actually conceded it yet. What they have been doing is pointing out that politically and tactically this was a very difficult election for them to fight. And they're rather pleased to have surprised themselves and confounded the opinion polls in doing as well as they did. And one other point, put to me by a very senior Conservative, extremely close to Mr Heath, that the variation in swings between one part of the country and another suggested perhaps a drift towards 2 nations, geographically and politically, a Conservative South and a Labour North, and that couldn't be good for the country. Martin Bell, Conservative headquarters.
And still in London, moving more particularly to the city now, let's call in Esther Ranson.
Good morning, Mr. Barrett. In fact, I've heard so much about the mood of the city, and here I am actually to meet it, face to face. Sir, what is the mood of the city?
Well, we're very pleased the election's over, and not too disappointed with the result. It could have been much worse.
How could it have been worse?
Well, with only a small majority, which looks likely, Labour's less likely to bring in an extreme programme, which could be very harmful to the city.
The crisis is even worse than we can possibly imagine. Is it really worse than you can imagine, do you think?
Yes, I think things are far worse than most of us have seen in our lifetime.
Heavens, that does sound bad. This lady works in the city. Have you noticed gloomy faces about you?
Very gloomy, very gloomy. Well, you'd think some of them were going to a funeral to see them running about.
What do you actually do?
I work in the stock exchange. I help on the cleaning department. I'm in charge of the lady cleaners there.
All right,
and
let me ask
see
you.
the men quite a lot there.
Do they ask you your view much?
Not much. They know my view and I know theirs by their faces.
Well, tell us your view.
Well, my view, I'm very sad to think that the Labour people are in because I like to see the city a bit happier. and they're not a bit happy. It's very dismal.
You get tired of all these sad faces?
Very, very.
So,
very sad.
If it had gone the other way, at least you would have had
They
a
would
few
have cheered.
smiles.
A few more smiles. Cheered some of them out much.
Anybody smiling about me this morning? I see a smile. Is that a smile on purpose?
Yeah, I think so, yes. Yes, I think what the lady just said is just the same. It's a standstill budget election.
And that's a good thing.
Well, I don't think it makes any difference. I've only got 2 points to raise, and that is keep off nationalisation and the unions to toe the line.
Right.
That's all I've got to say.
Stern advice, I'm
And
sure.
then we're pulled to.
Sir, how do you feel about it all this morning?
Well, it could be a lot worse, but I think the way the foreign exchange markets moved yesterday and the fact that the stock market continues to slide, or will continue to slide today, and was sliding very heavily yesterday, is a very good example of the way the country feels about the state of Parliament at the moment. The eve of election polls were very pro Mr Wilson and his merry band of men, and I don't really think the city likes us very much.
The rich people seem to be unhappier than the less well-off people.
Well, the rich people are probably going to get hit harder in the long run, and I think that's very understandable.
But
whether this is a good or a bad thing is neither here nor there. That's a very personal thing.
Let me ask you if it is a good or a bad thing.
Well, my attitude is that if you happen to have been lucky enough to be born into some money or what have you, well and good. Good luck to you.
And you should be allowed to hold on to it?
Personally, yes.
I see.
If you work your way out from the bottom and you can keep it, fair enough.
So, all in all, how do you think that this is going to affect the next few years, this election?
I think whichever way the election swung, we're going to be in for a very tough time over the next 2 years. I think we should just have to wait and see. Personally, I'm pessimistic.
And you think it's going to get worse and worse?
I can't see it getting much better, certainly over the next 6 to 9 months. 6 months or a year.
Anybody think it's not going to get worse and worse?
Personally, I don't think it's going to get worse.
Why not? You're going to tell me it couldn't get worse?
No, my guess is that the majority of factors have been discounted already. And at last we got some picture of what the outlook's going to be. It'll be a grim task ahead.
So you mean any news is better than no news?
Yes,
At least
I
we
think
know
the
where we are.
uncertainty of the last 12 months has been the real problem. Mark, in some respects, I think the people of the country have bought a bit of warmth for the winter. I'm pessimistic to that extent, a little cynical possibly. But over the long run, I think it's a good thing.
Well, at least that's a nice thing to end off with. Michael Barrett, over to you from the city.
Miss Esther Ranson there in the city. Well, now let's just bring ourselves up to date on the state of the party so far. David.
Well, the Labour Party has gained 18 seats. It needed 17 seats for a clear majority. But it hasn't got very great prospects of adding many to that. There are about 10 seats which in some theoretical way it might gain today, but there are only 2 or 3 where their chances are very good. The most notable one is Plymouth Drake, where they had 4 counts last night and they hadn't got an answer, and I'm sure the majority must be under 100 there. You don't have 4 recounts unless it's close, so that's a 50% chance. But then there are about 4 or 5 other seats, Bosworth, Braintree, Buckingham, that we're waiting for today, which will make the difference between their getting their minimum thing, which looks at the moment, say, a majority of 3, and their maximum, say, a majority of 11. There are quite a lot of other seats to watch, but they're all not between Labour and the other parties, between the other parties, between Conservative and SNP, or between Conservative and Liberal. Because only 25 of the seats that come up today are Labour seats, and only, as I say, another 5 or 6 of them are really potential Labour seats.
Could we look perhaps a bit further than just today, to a future, for example, for the Liberals? How do they stand now?
Well, they stand poised to take off. They've only lost 1 seat. Of the seats they actually held, they've lost Michael Winstanley, and we shall watch today whether they hold on to their 2 most marginal ones, or to come, Bodmin, where they hold by a majority of 9, which must be touch and go, and Berwick-on-Tweed. But they are going to end up, certainly in double figures in the next Parliament, which they haven't been in any election except 2 in the last 8 elections. They've been down at 6 seats most of that period. So there are quite a lot of seats where they're poised to take off still, but they aren't as well off as before, because their actual share of the vote now has dropped by 1%, although they fought a 5th more seats this time than they did before. They have pulled down their general position. It's been a bad day, but not a disastrous one. Here are the seats that they've got, and these are they only had 6 seats on the night, which were counting, and they've held on to these, though in every case except Cardigan and Colne Valley, with a reduced majority.
Well, talking of Liberals, let's talk about the best known, perhaps, after Jeremy Thorpe anyway, Liberal of them all, Joe Grimmond. And I was talking earlier on about results still to come in from far-flung places. One of the furthest flung, if Joe would accept that, is Orkney and Shetland.
The Orkney and Shetland Islands are normally preoccupied with local issues at election times, and the people tend to vote for a person rather than a party. They are very far from the centre of things. Shetland is as far north as Siberia and is as near Bergen in Norway as Aberdeen. But in the 1970s, the small electorate of these islands, 26,000 people, is immersed in issues important for the whole nation. And perhaps surprisingly, oil is not the sole reason for this. There are 2 distinct groups of islands. It's said that in the Orkneys, the people are farmers who do a little fishing, and in the more northerly Shetlands, they are fishermen who do a little farming. Both groups are suspicious of, if not opposed to, the common market. The farmers are particularly worried. Like farmers elsewhere, they have suffered from the rising prices of feedstuffs and fertilizers and from low prices for their livestock. They tend to blame Brussels. This is the point emphasized by the Labour candidate, Jonathan Wills, who himself is a crofter in the northernmost island of Unst and who supplements his income as a boatkeeper to a lighthouse.
I'm pushing very strongly our policy of renegotiating the common market terms of entry, and I'm supporting the referendum, and I'm urging people to vote against the market in the referendum, because there is no way you can get the right terms for Orkney and Shetland, not just for farming, for fishing as well. There is no way to get the right terms in the present structure of the common market.
The constituency's Liberal MP since 1950 is Joe Grimmond, and in the February election he took 62% of the vote. He's almost certain to retain the seat. The Liberal Party supports the EEC, but Mr Grimmond puts farmers high on his list of priorities, ahead of oil.
The most important immediate problem is a slump in agricultural prices. In the longer run, we are a bit worried about the future of fishing. We have the perennial question of the freights. And of course, we are affected by the national problem of inflation. On top of this, we have got to reorganize ourselves to meet oil.
It's being said in Lerwick, the only town in Shetland, that the islands were enjoying a period of quiet prosperity before the intrusion of oil. Shetland's famous wool and knitwear industry was picking up, and fishing is at the moment quite profitable. If the fishermen have any worries, it's that the common market will allow more foreign competition. The sea dominates the economic life of Shetland, and to a lesser extent Orkney, but it plagues the transport of both and makes electioneering tortuous. The Second World War helped transportation a little by providing the Churchill barriers, great concrete causeways between some islands to protect the naval base at Scapa Flow. Transportation puts up the cost of everything, and this is the one entirely local issue. These farmers in Fetlar, a northern island, were selling their sheep to a dealer with a boat. They would have got a better price in Aberdeen, but they could not afford the freight. This was uppermost in the mind of the Scottish National Party candidate when he was there. His greatest problem might be that many islanders don't consider themselves even part of Scotland. But on the specific local issue of freight, he was on safe ground.
Well, I think you saw this afternoon what the main issue in the election up here is, the future of island communities like that. Now, there's a beautiful island, kindly and hard-working people, and what's happening? They're being taxed because there are crippling freights. Everything that comes into that island and everything they sell out of the island, they have to pay this tax on freight.
Oil is not as yet the great issue that it is in Scotland. No one is calling for all the oil revenues here. But in a small island like Flotta, where a large tank farm is being constructed and the narrow roads are being churned up by huge machines, the impact is immediate. It was on Flotta that we caught up with the Conservative candidate, Raymond Fraser, a 27-year-old advocate from Edinburgh. He is the least known of the candidates and has spent several months trying to remedy this. Not unnaturally, in the middle of the construction, he was thinking of oil.
It's very impressive that the oil development is coming along as it is here, although it does seem to be somewhat slow and is affecting the environment quite considerably. And I would like to see, when the Conservatives set up the Scottish Development Fund, that a large percentage of the oil revenues which they take out of it are in fact apportioned to the Isles here.
At the end of the day, there is little excitement among the islanders about the election. and they will in fact argue more heatedly about little things, like the maps that for convenience put the islands in a little box in the Moray Firth, instead of where they should be, 700 miles north of London.
Now let's have a look at a couple of results, if we can. Let's go to Blythe, which was, of course, a Labour gain, as we've been saying, David.
So here, this is a sensational result that came in just after the end. We heard there was a recount before we went off the air. Just afterwards, we heard that Eddie Milne had been defeated by 78 votes after a recount. His gallant challenge against the machine had been beaten, or the steady Labour Party had triumphed against a maverick, whichever way you like to put it. But here was the third of the three defeats of of independents. The Taverne defeat, the Eddie Griffiths' failure to succeed as an independent in Sheffield Brightside, and now by a narrow margin, Eddie Milne's defeat in Blythe.
And what was certainly a remarkable result, that other one we had.
And this is the most remarkable result. It's the narrowest margin we've had in the whole results. It also is the lowest share of the vote of a victorious candidate in any election for 40 years. The victorious candidate only got 31% of the vote, and as you can see, it's an exact three-way tie with the Labour Party not that far behind the Conservative and SNP. But the SNP just drive out the Conservatives by 22 votes, and of course the second narrowest margin was a 30-vote margin for the SNP defeating the Conservatives in Galloway.
So that, as you say, was a remarkable result. I'm just about to hand over to Alistair Burnett, who's somewhere around me, but while I'm waiting for him, that's the time, 9 o'clock.
Well, now some news, some reaction from abroad first to the trend of results so far. In Washington, government officials are reported to have welcomed the majority government that's being predicted without making any comment on the fact that it's a Labour one. Diplomatic observers there believe that an announcement will be made soon by the White House on a meeting between President Ford and Mr. Wilson. In Ottawa, the parliamentary secretary to the Canadian External Affairs Minister said the election of a majority Labour government would be a welcome event which followed a recent trend in a number of countries. Officials in Paris are reported as saying they hope there'll now be a rapid conclusion to Britain's common market negotiations. They don't feel a Labour victory will necessarily lead to a British withdrawal from the community. The prospect of an overall Labour majority has also been welcomed in West Germany. The government there is also looking for a rapid conclusion to the common market renegotiations and an end to the uncertainty caused by a minority government in Britain. And some other news points. It's been a night of violence in Northern Ireland. A 30-year-old Roman Catholic was shot dead at Newton Abbey on the outskirts of Belfast when 3 men forced their way into his home. And a bomb was left in the driveway at the home of Mr. Aidan Corrigan, chairman of the County Tyrone branch of the Provisional Sinn Féin. It blew up as experts were dealing with it, but no one was hurt. In the United States, Mrs. Betty Ford, the president's wife, leaves hospital today. Doctors say she's made excellent progress after her operation for breast cancer 2 weeks ago. Dr. Kissinger, at the end of his visit to President Sadat in Cairo, has said he's encouraged by the talks. They'd given him more hope on the prospects for a lasting peace in the Middle East. Today, he flies on to the Syrian capital on the next stage of his tour of 7 countries. Now look at the weather with Michael Fish.
Good morning. Well, I think the early morning mistiness has cleared away now, so for the rest of the day, let's take the country into 2 parts. First of all, if we look at the eastern part of England they're a rather cloudy scene, I think, but even so, some sunshine from time to time, but quite a few showers coming through, and the odd one of these showers rather on the heavy side. For the rest of the country, that's western and northern parts, a brighter picture, sunny spells from time to time, but even there'll be the odd shower about, especially this morning on these north-facing coasts, North Wales, parts of Devon and Cornwall, that sort of area. And then perhaps more important of all is this evening and tonight, because I think once the sun goes down and it begins to get dark, then we're going to set in for quite a chilly night, and there may well be quite a lot of fog around by the morning. That's all from me.
Well, as you were watching the weather there, I was gathering up all my rubbish from this desk and about to get up from the hot seat because, Alistair, welcome, you're back with us, and you're very welcome to a very exciting day ahead indeed. Just while you're getting yourself dressed, if you'll forgive the expression, with your microphone and so on, let me just remind you of what was really quite a great moment during the night. Remember the Carmarthen result and the way the Welsh accepted it.
My branding Sion, where did dread gone? Da 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 dee
Good morning, and it's, I don't know, say it's nice to be back, but anyway, we are back now for the next run, which we will go through until we have the result of the election. Of course, we're not expecting any early results. They'll be coming in just before lunchtime. Good morning, Bob. You slept well?
Indeed well, yes. A long night it was.
Are you expecting a long day?
Indeed. A hard day's night, I think, too.
And just like some of the other long days have been, like 1964?
The parallel with 64 is striking. I think, in all probability, we won't have just that cliffhanger the last moment of the day, but I would have thought a very long, drawn-out day, a fascinating one, because of this question of will there be a working majority.
And David?
Well, we haven't yet heard anything from Northern Ireland, and that's a separate story we just haven't looked at. We've still got the Scottish story, which is not going to be as melodramatic as the polls suggested, but there are still, we've got 142 seats to come, only 25 of them are Labour held, and the ones that are to come, there are about, I reckon, about 20 where the result is not a completely foregone conclusion. Only about 6 or 7 are potential Labour gains. But I do think it's going to be an extremely interesting day, particularly in the 12 to 3 period when most of these results will come in.
And at the same time, it's going to be possible today to look at some of the politicking which is going on. Mr. Wilson, I think, did say to his press conference that he'd be going out to Chequers. But we don't know if there'll be any dramatic returns to London or if anybody will make any remarks about cabinet making, or whether there'll be any attempt by some of the other parties to put together any sort of formal opposition. Well, now Robin Day is also here, of course, and I think he's ready to talk to Arthur Palmer in Bristol.
Good morning, Mr. Palmer.
Good morning, Mr. Day.
What do you think about the result and the outlook?
Well, I think the result is, in the circumstances, not unexpected. I thought it would either be a smallish Labour majority or stalemate once again. But I'm very glad about the result. And our own results generally in Bristol have been excellent.
What do you think about the narrowness of the overall working majority? Do you think, we've had a number of interviews this morning with members of the public as they go to work, and 1 or 2 people were suggesting that the closeness of the result, although it's a majority for Labour, does suggest the need, perhaps the case for having a coalition, simply because nearly 60% of the country will have voted against socialists.
Well, I really do think that that idea must be dropped. It's just simply not real.
Why not?
Well, for this reason, I think that if it isn't possible, I think it's going to be possible for the Labour government to carry on, and in that case, the proper place, in my view, for a Labour Party, for the Labour Party, would be in opposition.
But do you think there's any mandate, in a popular sense, for the more left-wing policies of the Labour Party?
Well, I think to be again formal about it is a mandate for the programme of the party. It's not a very large majority, but it's certainly a mandate in normal British political terms. But of course, it'll be a question of priority. Some parts of the programme will come first, and quite a lot of it will probably have to wait.
Of course, there have been some criticism of Mr. Heath, but in a sense, Mr. Heath has done pretty well to get the Labour majority down as low as it is, hasn't he?
Well, that's not the view, really, that he took during the campaign. I mean, at one stage he thought he was going to win, and then when he could see that he wasn't, he wanted some kind of patched-up coalition, which obviously the country didn't believe in.
Well, you say the country didn't believe, but what do you think the country do believe in?
I think the country want an end to the parliamentary stalemate. They want a good and responsible government, and they want a useful and constructive opposition. You see, I think you could get, you could make quite a way forward in the sense of national unity by using the House of Commons system in the normal way. I mean, oppositions can always modify their policy if they really want to help the country.
So can governments.
Well, all right.
But you don't suggest that.
No, I didn't. I said that the programme of the party, the long-term programme of the party, and it's been said by Harold Wilson that it is a long-term programme, has been generally approved by the people in parliamentary terms. It's now a question of priorities.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Palmer.
And in your morning paper, you'll perhaps have seen some of the early seats to have changed hands going to Labour in the course of last night, but let's just remind ourselves of what we saw on television as the morning wore on. These are Labour's gains. Lincoln from Dick Taverne, Nelson and Cone, Rossendale, Oxford, Rochester and Chatham, Southampton Test, Ipswich, Bolton West, Ilford North, Peterborough, Bristol North West, Birmingham Selly Oak, Leicester South, all these coming from Conservatives, Welling and Hatfield, Bury and Ratcliffe, Hemel Hempstead, Berwick and East Lothian, Lichfield and Tamworth, and Labour gained there in Blythe, also from an independent, Mr. Eddie Milne. That was after some recount. So those are Labour's gains so far. One Conservative gain so far in Hazel Grove, taking that from the Liberal, Dr. Winstanley. And here are the Scottish National gains so far: Angus South, Perth and East Perthshire, Galloway and Dumbarton East, those last two with very small majorities indeed. And Plaid Cymru, the Welsh nationalist, one gain in Carmarthen, but that's one that matters a great deal to the heart of the party because that's where its president came back to the seat that he held in the 66 to 70 Parliament. Well, now, Bob Mackenzie is standing firmly in the battleground. What kind of movements do you expect to see on the field today?
Well, just for a moment, let's remind ourselves of what a small movement has actually occurred. With 493 results in, 25 seats have changed hands. Not a spectacular change. A kind of ripple went over the country of 1–2%, depending on what sort of region it was, roughly from conservative to Labour. And this is really a tiny movement of opinion, but a very vital one, granted the fact that it does raise the question of whether Labour has now come out of it with a working majority for the life of a Parliament. And the other thing to note is the seats that changed hands, when you turn to our battleground, have conformed to the theory of swing astonishingly well. First of all, on the Labour side, their marginals solidly held, the check mark indicating that, Labour territory being very solid indeed. The swing that we were talking about in marginals was just over 1%, and over the nation just over 2%. And here you see almost all the seats that changed hands. Here's where Labour bit into Conservative strength in just that way and made one, as it were, paratroop landing behind the line here. Otherwise, the Tories fighting back, rather surprisingly, holding these very narrowly held marginals like Northampton South or Upminster, Norfolk North West. So there was no sense an annihilation of the Tory position, and of course their position is quite solid as soon as you get as little as this far behind the lines. A solid line here at the seats that would go with 3%, a solid line of Tory successes. A containment, therefore, for the most part, of the Labour incursion. And, of course, very significant changes elsewhere. If you look just for a moment at the takeoff chart, the sad story for the Liberals, of course, is that although their vote stood up quite well, 18 to 19%, they did not get to the magic break-off point. And, indeed, they've lost seats so far and will obviously come out of this weaker. But it's another anomaly of the electoral system that you can do as well as they have done, not as well as last time, and still come out of it in this weakened condition. And the other anomaly, of course, that I mentioned last night is that the Labour Party comes to office with the smallest share of the vote that any majority parties had in 50 years. Something just in the vicinity, 40–41% is predicted by the computer as the final outcome of their share of the vote. Tories weakened, of course, but still very much a two-party domination, more than we've had in the last Parliament.
And as David was saying a short while ago, of course, we haven't heard yet from Northern Ireland. That's because, for security reasons, the count is taking place today. No counting last night, although, of course, in the old days, they used to count Belfast, certainly. And the interest in this election, remember that back in February, 11 Ulster Unionist loyalists all came back to only one representative of the Social Democratic and Labour Party, representative of the Catholic minority in Northern Ireland. And, of course, the interest today is whether the Loyalists will come back 11 strong or slightly weakened. After all, there are two seats there where it's quite possible that because there's not the competition on the Catholic side, that the Loyalists could lose in Fermanagh and South Tyrone, and also in Mid-Ulster. This remains to be seen. Bob?
The supreme irony, really, of the electoral system was that the Ulster Unionists got 11 out of 12 seats with 51% of the vote. If ever there was a distortion of the actual share of opinion, it is in Northern Ireland, when the appearance to the ordinary layman was, they swept 11/12 of the board. They had 51% of the vote. And that is really the most alarming indication of how far out of line a vote can get.
Well, that, of course, is in the Westminster election in Northern Ireland, not now in elections for the assemblies in Northern Ireland. But these are two possibilities where, in fact, Mr. Wilson probably can expect some kind of support if these two seats were to tip over out of Loyalist hands. But the man that most attention has been focused on is Mr. Enoch Powell, of course. This time he's standing in South Down, inheriting a seat there because he has not been able to find, apparently, a winnable seat here in this part of the United Kingdom. Mr. Powell went to South Down. He took over the seat held by Captain Orr in the past. And everybody expects that he'll be returned. I don't think any of his opponents even there suppose that Mr. Powell could be defeated today. And if indeed Mr. Harry West, who has been the leader of the United Ulster Unionists, were defeated in Fermanagh and South Tyrone, that would seem to some people to open the way for Mr. Enoch Powell to take over the leadership. Well, now we have a report from Brian Walker.
Well, you may have seen those demonstrators outside Conservative Party headquarters at Smith Square last night calling for Ted Heath's replacement by Enoch Powell. And that commuter about half an hour ago from Wolverhampton South West, Mr. Powell's former constituency at Birmingham New Street Station, saying that he's forgiven him for voting Labour last time. He seems to have some drawing power in England and certainly in Northern Ireland. Around his campaign in the rural constituency of South Down, he has been cheered to the echo, particularly when he has criticised the policy of Conservative and Labour governments alike towards Northern Ireland as playing into the hands of the IRA. There's not much doubt that Mr. Enoch Powell will be returned for the South Down constituency as a United Ulster Unionist candidate. One thing which might affect the size of the majority is that Mr. Brian Faulkner, the former Chief Minister, has called on his supporters in this constituency to vote for his opponent. That probably won't, however, affect the outcome. And Mr. Powell has already in his campaign speeches been talking about future tactics in Westminster. Although he won't hold the balance of power with the United Ulster Unionists, he may now begin to look more attractive once again to the Conservatives, particularly as the United Ulster Unionists may be expected to deliver something between 9 to 11 seats. And under certain conditions, namely Conservative support for their policies and abandonment of power sharing with Roman Catholics, could well mean that the Conservatives will once again draw support from Enoch Powell. But that very much remains to be seen and will be up to negotiations in the next Parliament. Back now to Alistair Burnett.
And now the Labour government, whether it's a clear overall majority, excuse me, whether it's a clear overall majority, as we still expect, or whether it's going to be in something of a minority, one of the big problems that it faces, apart from Britain's own economy, is its precise relationship with the common market. Some people have felt that Mr. Wilson has been rather avoiding this issue under the blanket term of renegotiation. And there have been conflicting views as to whether Mr. Wilson himself and some of his senior ministers, like Mr. Callaghan and others, really want to take Britain out. And of course, therefore, the renegotiation terms are going to be very important indeed in the coming months. And when the renegotiation is over, the question is, how is this to be put to the people, as Mr. Wilson has said it will? Will it be in a referendum, or will it be in another ballot, perhaps another general election? And that equally is of first-class importance to those pro-Europeans sitting inside Mr. Wilson's cabinet, particularly Mr. Roy Jenkins, Mrs. Shirley Williams and Mr. Reg Prentice. Well, that is an issue, a very big hurdle for the new government to overcome in the course of the next year. I think, Robin, you can talk now to Charles Wheeler in Brussels.
Yes, you said some of the things I was hoping to say, Alistair, but no matter. We're all in the same programme. Charles Wheeler.
Yes, Robin.
Bonjour.
Good morning.
You're not very European. What does it look like over there? Have you had a chance to look at morning papers or call people or anything like that?
Yes, it's been reported here as a Labour victory. The newspapers are obviously a bit out of date. It was thought that it would be a working majority. Now, in the radio, it's been reported just as you're reporting it. But I think people made up their minds what they wanted, the community at least, the community countries, what they wanted before the election. I don't think there's any doubt that the better of the two alternatives to Europe was a Labour victory. The point is, from the community, the one overriding consideration is to get this tiresome problem of whether Britain is going to stay in or out of the community settled once and for all. And it was felt that if the Conservatives came back, Europe would have to wait for the pendulum to swing again in 3 or 4 years before that issue was resolved. It's thought that this will now happen.
I put this point to Mr. Heath on the eve of Pole, and he very strongly objected to this and said what the European leaders wanted, and this was, he said, to his personal knowledge, was a government and a leader whom they could trust, and he said they couldn't trust Harold Wilson. Have you come across that attitude?
No, quite honestly, I haven't. I don't agree with this. I don't think this can be true. I mean, these people are dealing with realities, not with what they want. There's no question that back in February they would have preferred a Conservative victory, though they were already, even at that time, becoming a little bit disillusioned with Mr. Heath as a European. But now the important thing is to get the issue over.
Of course, do they realise now that the issue has not got over now? Because with a narrow majority, it's quite possible, A, that a referendum bill wouldn't get through the House of Commons, because there'd be some Europeans revolt on the Labour side, perhaps. And secondly, that even if the referendum went against the common market, the parliamentary majority might not go in favour of a bill to repeal the European Communities Act.
I think they dimly realise this, but I think there's another factor arising, which is that I think Europe may decide, eventually, sometime in the next 6 months, that they must force the issue themselves. This has been dragging on a long time. It is holding the community back. And although the Labour government, the last Labour government, has been working within the system, as they put it. They have been negotiating from within. In fact, the real issue hasn't been joined yet, and that real issue is something that's becoming of greater importance to the Europeans day by day, and that is simply this: what about these long-range aims like European Union in the distant future? And they are reaching the point where they're saying now, the French particularly, who are now in charge of the community, in the chair, we have to start facing that issue. And but there we have to ask the British what their point of view is.
But do you come across any impression among Europeans that you speak to, leading people in Brussels or in the countries of Europe, that a Labour government now, in fact, is seriously intending to recommend exit from the common market, in view of the fact that Mr. Callaghan has said quite clearly that he's not now renegotiating the treaties, whatever else he's trying to renegotiate?
I think the feeling over here is as it is in Britain, that on the whole, this particular people, the majority of the Labour cabinet would probably like to stay in. But at the same time, the feeling is growing here that perhaps Britain is more of a drag than it ought to be, and perhaps the British ought to go. So that I don't think it's entirely a British decision. I think the Europeans may decide that it suits them, that it becomes expedient with time to make it difficult for the government to recommend acceptance.
Well, whatever they think, they can't kick us out.
No,
we want to stay in. They've stuck with us.
But they could make it very difficult, I think, for a Labour government to recommend acceptance to the British people in a referendum, and I think there is a danger of that. I don't think it's reached that point yet, but I think that's a possibility that everybody has to reckon with.
Thank you very much, Charles. Maybe we'll come back to you during the day, I don't know, but thank you very much indeed. Good morning.
And for, I think, Bob, you have a point, haven't you?
Well, just one point in connection with the likely stand of the incoming government, assuming a Labour majority government. On Panorama on Monday night, Jim Callaghan took a much stronger stand than I've heard him take before, saying that he hopes, earnestly hopes, that the new government, Labour government, will take a positive stand one way or the other, positive in the sense of recommending to the country how it should vote in a referendum. And that means that, and he seemed to talk of something that was a few months away, that there must be a very critical moment for a narrowly based government in the House when they try to take a stand, as their Foreign Secretary wants to, as a government, for or against a yes-no vote in that referendum. So that might be the first really fascinating moment in the life of the new government when an attempt is made to get a cabinet position.
And no doubt many permutations to go on there, and many problems for the Labour whips on the backbenches if that were to come about. Now, for one pro-European, there's still an important day ahead because he's not quite sure how large his party is going to be, which he's going to lead in the House of Commons. Mr. Jeremy Thorpe had a slightly reduced majority in his own seat in North Devon. He has heard of one Liberal loss so far. He certainly hasn't been given very much encouragement to expect many Liberal gains. And down in the countryside in North Devon, of course, there's the Thorpe Cottage, and also following Mr. Thorpe during the campaign and last night, David Lomax.
Well, good morning, Alistair. Here in North Devon, I suppose Mr. Jeremy Thorpe must be rather a disappointed man this morning. It still is Thorpe country. Here in Devon North, he's held a seat for 15 years. But of course, last night his majority was cut from 11,000 to less than 7,000. He was chaired through the middle of Barnstaple, but then came back here to his cottage, Higher Chuggerton, near Cobberton. He's in there listening to all the results. He'll be having his breakfast, and he'll be coming out later on. He'll talk to us about 11 o'clock this morning. But he must be a very disappointed man. We talked to him earlier this morning, you probably saw it. He was very reluctant to comment on what the general reduction in the Liberal votes meant. He was still talking in terms of the electoral system being a bit of a casino for the Liberals. But this morning he'll be on the telephone, and there'll be obviously a post-mortem about the Liberal results. And we hope to talk to him at about 11 o'clock.
David, is it really as beautiful down there as it looks, or are you standing in front of a backdrop?
No, it really is a very, very beautiful morning here.
Good. And at long last, perhaps the good weather has come after the election, which we often expect to have during an election campaign in order to cheer the voters up. We are, of course, waiting for the results to come in, and as we've seen, counting has begun in some places, and in Plymouth Drake, coming up, I think, for the 4th or 5th time at 9:30. They may now perhaps be the first to declare. But given the overnight situation, Graham Pyatt, how is your prediction standing up, and what indeed is your prediction at the moment?
Well, we had 493 results in last night, and on that basis we're predicting that the Labour Party will win 322, Conservatives 276, Liberals 11, and the others 26. On the slidometer we're showing a very small margin of uncertainty, but that small margin is a very critical one because it doesn't tell us quite whether Labour will get a working majority over all parties or whether in fact they will be right on the brink of the critical 318.
Now, if it is just a small majority that's coming up overall, David, we were saying last night this plainly brings problems to a government, but you were also saying that a small majority of this kind does seem to strengthen the moderates, that they who might have been trampled down in a rush if it had been a very huge Labour majority, particularly over a subject like Europe, could now speak out and hold their own inside the party. Do you stick to that?
I stick to that. I think there's a great deal of difference in whether the majority ends up as 3 or 11, because it means that a by-election is much more critical if the majority is down at a lower figure than a higher figure. And it also means that the single rebel, the 1 or 2 people who say they'll buck the party whip with a straight face to the whips, it's the end of my career. I'm still not going to go with you on this. 1 or 2 people can hold a party to ransom if the margin is extremely small. Now, I think, in fact, of course, the Labour margin is going to be a little bigger than we're suggesting, because there are some people from Northern Ireland, probably, and 1 or 2 nationalists who will vote with the Labour Party. Nonetheless, I am quite clear that the people who have more leverage in a narrow majority situation are the moderates than the extremes, because the moderates have somewhere else to go. The extremes have nowhere else to go.
There is the point, though, that, say, on the European question, a lot of these small parties, like the Scottish National Party, the Ulster Unionists, even the SDLP in Ulster, Plaid Cymru, would, of course, be opposed to going into Europe. They've made that fairly clear. They certainly are very strong for having a referendum almost against. And again, there would be some Conservative rebels, perhaps, because the Conservatives are under no such pressure to hold their own ranks.
I think that's true. I think the Conservatives love to embarrass the Labour Party on this in some ways, and yet they can't play around too much with an issue that has been central to their policies. I would have thought the Conservatives and Liberals would try and keep a pretty strict line on this issue.
Now, on the other question, the actual getting through of budgets and some controversial legislation, say about a wealth tax or measures of that nature, do you think that Mr. Wilson can hold the line? He'd have a united party behind him on that sort of issue.
I would have thought he could hold the line, but he's going to have more snap votes, more decisions against him on small matters, and I think it will be a slightly more flexible Parliament. It won't be as flexible as the last Parliament, where he had to accept defeat because he just didn't have the votes. He will have the votes in this Parliament for anything he really wants to get through.
On nationalisation, back in the 1964-66 Parliament, it was possible then for 2 right-wing members of the Labour Party really to foul up the nationalisation plans for steel at that time.
But then there weren't any nationalists, and some of the nationalists are, in fact, quite explicitly socialists. And I think the majority is going to be a little bigger than it was in 1964.
Although, again, perhaps on something like North Sea oil, the Scottish nationalists and even the Welsh nationalists who hope of oil off their own shores in what's now called, I think, the Celtic Sea, they wouldn't like a Labour nationalisation that nationalised it for England or for the United Kingdom?
What seems to be absolutely plain is in this situation, Mr. Wilson's political skills, which probably are greater than anybody else's in the game, are going to be called for. He is going to have to manage his majority, manage his parliament to get what he wants. I think it will bring out all his political skills to the full.
Do you expect to see these skills as with the young Mr. Wilson, Bob?
Well, certainly there's no sign of a failure of any of those skills up to now. Could I pick up one point David made where he said moderates' positions may be strengthened because they have someplace else to go? Now, one of the events of this election has been that moderates who did try to go someplace else, that is, Mayhew to the Liberals, Dick Taverne being independent, have been clobbered. And I think, therefore, there's a terrific reinforcement of the idea, which is maybe a good or bad thing, that you've got to live within your party and stay there, because the recent examples are of what happens if you walk out or try to get a third force going or whatever else. And therefore, I think it's a reinforcement of party loyalties and a tendency to stay, encourage people to stay and fight it out for better or for worse within their own party.
That was very much the point that Roy Jenkins was making when he was talking to Robin earlier this morning. I thought Mr. Jenkins had rather an interesting smile, as if on the face of the tiger during the course of that interview. He may well have got this revolt of the moderates and the strength of the moderates in mind as he was talking then.
I think moderates, though, have an extra strength. That is the man who is about to retire, the kamikaze character who says, the hell with it, I'm going to get my way. If he's on the far left, he's not going to do anything by defeating the Labour government. But if he's in the centre, he may say, I care more about staying in Europe than anything else. My last service to my country in my 60s, as I'm coming up to retirement, may be to do this. And there were certainly some people during the 1970 to 74 Parliament who had precisely that attitude, members who had announced they were going to retire and had nothing to look for from the leaders of the Labour Party.
But most of them are gone.
Most of them are gone.
Well, but someone like, say, Michael Stewart is there in Fulham. He has no, presumably, expectations of high office again, and yet he is a pronounced pro-European.
And George Strauss.
And John McIntosh is back, though, who is in a marginal seat, but has said very strong things indeed about the importance of going to Europe.
Well, he is used to living dangerously. Well, now, these are some of the problems of a government, a small majority or even minority. Robin Day is now talking to two historians, Lord Blake and A.J.P. Taylor.
And Lord Blake, of course, is the biographer of Disraeli, and Alan Taylor is the biographer of Lord Beaverbrook. Mr. Taylor, what is your view of as a historian of a government at a critical time with a majority of this size, which looks as though it's going to be in single figures, perhaps?
I think there are cases where a government with a small majority has been able to hold its own. It does demand greater political skill, and certainly Harold Wilson's got that. It demands party loyalty, which I should judge in the Labour Party is stronger than it has been for some years past. That the conflicts which used to rack it have been pushed aside. The division between moderates and extremists, which people make much of, is certainly much less than it's been on previous...
You believe moderation is another word for indecision, don't you?
Well, I used that term last time when we were talking about Liberals.
I remember well.
I suppose it's possible. I couldn't contemplate it myself, but it is possible in the Labour Party to be moderate and yet to have firm Labour loyalties, and I think there will be far less conflict inside the Labour Party than we've seen in past governments.
Except on the common market, of course.
Indeed, and this is something which the Labour Party will accept as an issue so large and of such national importance that it will tolerate, I wouldn't say conflict, but differences.
Lord Blake, as a Conservative and a historian, how do you see this problem of a narrow working majority at a time of national crisis?
I rather agree with what Alan Taylor has said. I think it can be done. You can carry on like that. In a sense, all times seem to be times of national crisis at the time, and the Conservatives themselves did carry on with a pretty small majority from 1951 to 55. Labour carried on with a very small majority indeed, 50-51 and 64 to 66.
It's interesting, don't you think, that the British people are not going to be swept into any sort of radical move. They're not smashing the two-party system. They're not giving a big majority to anybody. They're saying, well, carry on, but we're not going to give you too big a majority?
Yes, it's been, in that
a
way...
A Conservative decision with a small
C, I think it has, yes. I certainly don't think that this vote, that Mr. Wilson's victory, if it is a victory, represents a great triumph for radicalism.
Would you say that if, say, the majority is only like it was in '64, or a bit bigger, say about 5, 6, 7 votes, the working majority, do you think there's a case for coalition being urged on the government? I know that Wilson said he won't do it, but...
I don't think there's much point in urging something on people who you know are going to refuse it. I think the trauma of 1931 is so deep in the Labour Party that they will do almost anything rather than have a coalition.
You are nodding...
well, I'm sure that this is what weighs decisively with the Labour Party, that from Labour's point of view, the 1931 coalition was not only a disaster for the party when its leaders went over, it was, in my opinion, a disaster for the country, that this so-called coalition turned out to be simply a block of the right, a way in which the more extreme Conservatives ate up everyone else. There is no conceivable possibility, except in face of real national disaster.
How do you compare the campaign leadership of Mr. Heath and Mr. Wilson in this campaign with other leaders whose performances you have written about or studied? Lord Blake.
I think that Mr. Wilson has conducted a very skillful campaign. He is, of course, an extremely skillful politician, which is a very different thing from being a statesman. He is a very, very able party leader. I think there's no doubt about that.
He was pointing out last night that Gladstone had formed his 4th administration. This will be Mr. Wilson's 4th administration if he formed one. He formed his 1st administration when he was older than when Harold Wilson is forming his 4th. And how old was Gladstone when he formed his 4th? About 80-something.
Yes, he was in his mid-80s.
82, I think.
Yes, and was very tiresome in cabinet as a result, because whenever anything was put up by his colleagues which he didn't like, he became very deaf. And on the other hand, of course, once he started talking, nothing could stop him, because expostulations or interruptions did not penetrate into his hearing if he didn't want to get them. Now, Harold hasn't got this asset of either deafness or old age, but he certainly has others. He is, as Robert Blake says, a very skillful party leader, and I think he has managed this campaign much better than he did the last one, certainly than the time when he lost to the Conservatives.
May I bring in, gentlemen, to our discussion, an elder statesman of the Labour Party, Lord Houghton, former Labour Member of Parliament for Sowerby, former chairman of the Parliamentary Party. Lord Houghton, may I call you Douglas?
Yes, certainly.
You've been listening to our 2 distinguished historians.
Yes, I have.
What's your verdict on this result? Do you think it's, I know you would have liked a bigger majority, but do you think it's all in all a good result for the nation?
No, I don't think it's good enough. You know, I doubt whether this Parliament can go its full term. I don't think that a large majority is necessarily an indication of strong government. I think strong government is largely what governments do, what courage they have, what wisdom they have. Sometimes a large majority results in flabby government, and certainly some of the indecisive periods of the Labour government of 1966 to 1970 were when the majority was 60 and 70.
Now, after all, the minority government we've just seen has been quite decisive on a number of things, hasn't it?
It's done a great deal more than I thought it would do without a majority in the House. I think it was remarkable what it did.
I'm very interested in with all your shrewdness and experience of Parliament, that you think the Parliament won't run its full term. Do you foresee an early general election?
No, but I see a lot of trouble over the common market.
Yes, and when you say trouble, you mean not being able to get a referendum?
Well, I think there are many difficulties there. We have no constitutional provision for a referendum, and there are some very contentious matters to be settled. If you look at what happened in Denmark, for example, they had a 6-month run-up to a referendum. All such questions as what minimum poll there shall be, what kind of majority there shall be, how valid shall the referendum result be.
But those considerations don't arise under our Constitution, because nothing can be binding on Parliament.
No, but they have to go into an Act of Parliament.
Yes, but that wouldn't take long unless there was a majority against it.
Well, it depends what difficulties there are about it. I wouldn't be able to foresee.
Some of your Labour Europeans might not want to support a referendum.
It may be that. I'm not convinced myself yet that it will take the form of a referendum in conventional terms.
Well, that means a general election within 12 months, because the alternative is a general election.
I wouldn't predict. I can't see the course of events yet on the common market. All I know is it looms ahead.
But Labour has pledged to have either a referendum or a general election within 12 months, hasn't it?
It may not be possible. I just don't know. After all, Labour can't decide to have a referendum if there's not the result to have the referendum on. And this doesn't depend wholly on a Labour government. It depends on the course of the negotiations.
Can I just comment on what Mr. Houghton has been saying, A.J.P. Taylor? What do you think about that?
My mind on a referendum certainly is also a blank. We've never had one. It would demand a special act of Parliament. I don't think it's all that difficult. And in a sense, with all the commitments that parties have entered into in the past, that the people should be consulted, it would not be an outrageous thing to do, though it would be a new thing to do. And there's a lot to be said for new things.
You remember that in I think it was it 1918 or 19, certainly around there, Churchill wanted a referendum on the question of votes for women. Because of the differences in the Liberal cabinet, you remember?
Referendums have often been floated as an idea. From several times in English history it's been thought of, but nothing's ever come of it. I'm personally against it, but still, I think I would be even more against a second general election within a year. And I think the Labour government would be ill-advised to call that on all current form that one can guess. I think the public would resent it, and they would have a very good chance of losing it. Of course, that I'd welcome.
Thank you, Lord Blake and Mr. Taylor. We may come back to you again. Thank you, Douglas Houghton. Perhaps we'll have another word from you later, perhaps when we get some more results in. Thank you very much. Alistair?
Well, I must say another general election, Robin, within another year, that would be putting it a bit strong. After all, there are some constituencies where they've already had 3 elections, by-elections and general elections in the course of a year. It would be becoming a national industry, as of course it has become in Northern Ireland. Let's look at the state of the parties, which must be a preoccupation of Mr. Wilson's particularly at this time, with these results going through his mind and wondering what the next few hours are going to bring. At the moment, Labour, 294 seats, and they have a net gain there of 18 seats. The Conservatives so far have 185 seats, and over on the right we see there a net loss of 20. The Liberals, with 5 seats, have lost 1, and the others, we have so many packed into the others, it's difficult to follow. Of course, there are 2 independents out there, Dick Taverne and Eddie Milne, and there are some gains, of course, for others, particularly Plaid Cymru and the Scottish National Party. Now, Bob is with our map, our operational map of how things have swung inside the country. Bob?
Well, this shows where this really rather small number of changes, seats, have occurred. We've now got almost 500 results in, and yet there are something like 25 seats that have changed hands. Not a very big movement, really. If you look at Scotland, of course, the 4 Scot Nat gains here, the 5 Conservative losses, 1 Labour gain. If you look at the Northwest, again an area we expected considerable change in, you find 4 Labour gains and these results for the other parties. Nothing at all in the area here described in this region as North, and rather less change in the Midlands, I think, than we might have expected on the earlier figures in the rest. 3 net Labour gains, 3 Conservative losses. The 1 Labour loss and 1 Nationalist gain in Wales, and then quite modest changes. In the home counties, 4 seats to Labour on the whole, overall, and 4 Conservative losses. And in London, really hardly any change at all. I think that's the startling thing, in a sense, that this tiny ripple of opinion, 1%, 2% changing sides across the nation, has produced really just enough to make the difference between the minority Labour government and a Labour government with a very bare majority.
And we are, of course, expecting to have some further moves on Bob's map later on in the programme as we get the results coming in today, including some of the recounts which have been going on. Now, Tom Coyne, I think, is in Birmingham now and is going to talk to some people after the vote and get some of their reactions. Tom?
Well, the commuters here in Birmingham on their way to work have been surprised there by the state of the parties. What do you feel, sir, about the way things are going?
Oh, I'm very disappointed at the poor showing of the Liberals, and I view with absolute horror what we're in for the next 4 years.
But as things are close, does this not sort of make you feel a little better?
Not really. It looks as if Labour are going to get an overall majority, and heaven help us. Them's my sentiments in a nutshell.
Well, if that's your feeling, and other people have expressed it this morning, why do you think there's been such a low turnout and things have gone the way they have?
I just don't know. I'm surprised people are so stupid, but they are. And we're going to have a Labour government. Full stop.
I'll turn to you. How do you feel about the way things are going?
Well, the Labour Party at the moment should have done a bit more on what they have done, because they haven't broadcasted it a lot of how the government...
But are you happy with the fact that they've got, or it looks as if they're going to have a majority? Are you happy about that?
Yes, in that case, yeah.
What about the ladies round about?
I'm totally disappointed about the result at the moment. Why? Well, I would have liked to have seen the Conservatives have another go. I expected the Liberal result to be as it was, because I felt that people were voting against their parties last time in protest, because I did the same thing myself. So I was one of the floating Liberals who returned back to the fold this time.
And you thought that might be a general trend?
I thought it might.
Has anyone else got any views? Anybody happy that Labour have got...
Well, yes, I'm glad Labour have got in, got a majority, and I think Harold Wilson is the only person that can get the country back on its feet.
Would you like to have seen a bigger majority then?
Yes, I would. Yes.
What about you, Madam?
Well, I'm disappointed. I don't think Ted Heath has come over very well on the television, but I think he has, he's a great man, and I think he would have seen us through this. I'm very worried about the future.
A lot of people have said this morning that they think that it's time for Ted Heath to go. Would anyone agree with that?
Yes,
I'm not really.
Yeah, but you're a Labour man.
Yes, not really.
Well, thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
Well, some seem to be happy, but a few doubts there, all right. Now, I think this is a chance to see what the votes cast so far have been for the parties in this election. We're not going to have a commercial for Robert Mackenzie on that, and proportional representation. No doubt we'll have many opportunities of talking about that. We'll get those votes along in a moment. But I do see sitting beside me a figure, not actually wrapped in sackcloth and covered with ashes, the figure of Humphrey Taylor, who was responsible for our poll last night. We are keeping the wrath of Mackenzie from you, Humphrey, and it's only friendly David Butler and myself who are going to put you in the most gentle terms. Now, how do you feel about the poll this morning?
Well, I think that you've done us less than justice, actually. Perhaps I can point out some of our findings, and I haven't got all of the figures of the actual results in front of me because I went home and had some sleep last night. But we certainly gave you the right order of result at Stirling-Falkirk. We, I think, gave you more or less the correct picture in Scotland with our Scottish poll. We showed the huge surge by the SNP, not quite catching Labour, with the Tories losing very heavily there. And looking at our final figures for Great Britain, which were not, of course, the figures that you used for the 10 o'clock forecast, but using the final figures up until voting ended at 10 o'clock, we had a Labour lead of 7.8, which is a swing of 4.4, which is, in fact, not enormously different from the actual result. They are sufficiently different to make a lot of difference in terms of seats. Having said that, I'm not defending this.
I mean, in fact, the post polls are supposed to be much more accurate. They're a larger sample. They don't have a lot of the uncertainty of forecasts. And yet the actual final margin, as far as we can make out, is going to be a Labour lead over the Conservatives of about 3%. This is a really pretty wide margin of error for a post poll.
Well, it means that we are going to be within 2 or 3% of each of the parties, which is not good, and I'm not defending it, but I don't think it's anything like as bad as, in fact, some people may have thought or said. I think one of the problems is that we had to produce the 10 o'clock forecast with voting up until 8:15. We had assumed that the pattern which we'd found at previous urban constituencies of, in fact, Labour pulling up in the last hour and a half was going to take place. It didn't happen. If anything, the gap, I think, narrowed in the last hour and a half. And that's one of the reasons why we produced some slightly odd estimates of seats at that time.
I think one of the things, Humphrey, has been that the poll taken on the actual day of polling has usually been very good indeed, and we've had much greater confidence in that, particularly after the successes in 1970 and in February. But of course, in some of the by-elections, here and there, these polls have gone wrong. Is this because there are certain kinds of respondents who won't play this particular game? Some people coming out from the voting booths who still keep it confidential?
Well, I don't know the complete answer to that, and we're obviously doing a substantial post-mortem to try and find out more. I think one of the problems is that we have to, for obvious logistical reasons, to concentrate on a relatively small number of polling stations, and there's no actual hard information about how polling districts vote as opposed to wards or constituencies, and therefore we're not able to check whether our sample of polling stations is as representative as we can, for example, when we're taking a sample of constituencies. This is because, obviously, every time you cover a polling station, that's a team of interviewers. Another problem undoubtedly is refusals, and normally we thought that refusals tended to come more from elderly Conservatives. On this occasion, this does not seem to be the case.
But Humphrey, if this was a debark for the post-polls, wasn't it even more of a debark for the pre-polls? I mean, the actual forecasts, every one of them was suggesting a lead for the Labour Party, for the Conservative Labour Party of considerably more than 3%. And many of them were suggesting leads of 9–10%. This is as bad a result as the polls have ever had. I mean, 1970 was the worst one before this. This is rather worse than 1970.
When you were right.
I wouldn't say that it's worse than 1970. I don't think even that the size of the errors are as big as 1970, if you can describe them as such. I think that one has to make the point here that the polls, first of all, were correct in showing the direction of the swing. They were correct in showing the winner. They were correct in showing that the Liberal vote wouldn't rise. And that, you know, that the size of the actual the differences between the polls and the results are not enormous.
Well, now,
I think
Robin,
there's another very important point, if I may, which we did stress in every written report, I think every poll and every paper, that they were measuring voting intention at some period, some time before polling day. We always said that that was not a prediction, and in fact that things could change after the poll was taken. I think we've got good reason to believe they did change.
Robin, I think you have a point.
Well, yes, sir, I've been sitting rather impatiently here because I think much more important than whether the polls were right or wrong, and even if they were right, even if they'd been right, it seems to me there's a very strong case for banning opinion polls during a campaign. I didn't used to think that, but I'm beginning to think it now. Can you really defend the publication of polls during a campaign? Because I suggest to you that they are becoming a gross contempt of the electoral process.
Well, we have a vested interest, and that vested interest is to have them banned, because I wouldn't have my head on the block every time there was an election. Having said that, to ban opinion polls is a form of censorship.
Why?
And because you're saying we will not allow people to publish this information.
No, I would not allow them to. I would not allow them to. I would not allow them to survey opinion for the purposes of publishing a poll, except on behalf of a bona fide candidate.
Robert, I'm not as skilled at the television techniques as some of your people who interview, and I was going on to say that not to publish opinion polls is to say that the British electorate is not mature enough to digest this information. Well, and that it's a very elitist view, if I may say so, that the British public shouldn't be allowed to have the best available information, however subject to error, on the state of the parties, and instead that they should be fed what journalists who do not do scientific polls may think, or indeed what the political parties may think.
Scientific? You still sticking to that justification, scientific?
I'm absolutely convinced that the polls that we published on the eve of election day were pretty accurate measurements of what the state of the parties were at that time. Yeah, and I believe that what happened was, and this is obviously something we will have more information on later, but as of now, my belief is that quite a lot of Labour voters did not turn out to vote, and that quite a lot of people, or a small number of people, but an important minority of Liberals, did in fact decide that they would vote Tory in the hope of keeping out a large Labour government.
But are you responsible for that? Did you actually cause that change, do you think?
Well, I think that's a possibility.
But don't you think that the publication of polls, whether they're right or wrong during a campaign, A, distracts people from discussing the issues? Whenever there's a poll comes out, it's in the headlines and at the front of a news bulletin, above the real arguments in the election. They cause politicians to affect their candidate, to affect their arguments. It does seem to me that it's a contempt of the true electoral process, and it's gone too far.
Well, if it's gone too far because the media, and that includes television, the BBC, the newspapers, publish this information because they think people want it. And there's no doubt from my experience that people are very, very interested indeed in what the polls are saying. Now you're saying don't let them have that information.
Humphrey, we're going to give you a really hard time now because while we've been engaging you on this side, we have an attack coming from the rear, and Bob Mackenzie.
Well, it's not an attack, really. First of all, of course, Robin is wrong in saying you could ban them, because what happened when the Germans tried to ban them voluntarily... Sorry, but the Germans tried to ban them.
I take a different opinion from you.
Yeah, okay.
Not wrong. Don't be so.
No, let's fire into our own side.
You're getting a little tired, Robin.
You're not talking to your students now, Bob.
Nor are you. You're not browbeating a politician now.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that when the Germans tried to get a voluntary agreement not to publish them, what happened? The London Times sent over made a polling arrangement, polled in Germany, reported them back in London, and of course you can't prevent newspapers from taking that news. So there is a problem. But equally, I am sure that David is on the right point here. The danger this time, and I believe last time, was that there could have been an effect on the intention to vote by people reading every day Wilson with a huge lead, huge lead. I think Mr. Wilson, if he loses a clear majority, in this election may have lost them because of the influence of the opinion polls.
That's why I say it's a corruption of the democratic process.
Well, I think my little stratagem there, Humphrey, came off about as well as the Russian attack at Tannenberg. So I think we can hear anything to say, David?
No, I think I'll leave it at that.
All right, we'll let you go now, Humphrey. Thank you very much. Of course, we do accept that your poll told us that there would be an overall majority for Labour, and indeed that seems to be what the results have produced so far. You were right, indeed, about the Scottish nationalist surge, although pointing at the same time, as we did at the beginning, that Labour increasing its vote at that time meant that the Scottish nationalists would be in some difficulty in Labour-held seats. So, thank you. And now let's see how they've taken it overnight, after the parties in the morning perhaps are over, and go round some of the party headquarters in Smith Square, which have been the rendezvous for journalists and television throughout the election campaign. First to the victors, Labour headquarters. Outside there is Keith Graves.
And we here at Transport House in London have the first news of the new day of the Prime Minister, Mr. Wilson. I was talking a few minutes ago to a member of his staff in his suite in the Adelphi Hotel in Liverpool, and I was assured that he was having a shave and watching this programme and was in the best of spirits. Very cheerful about the outcome so far, said one of his secretaries. Mr. Wilson, in fact, is going to fly from Speke Airport at about lunchtime to Northolt, and then he's going to go straight home to Lord North Street, where he'll drop off Mrs. Wilson. That's just across the square from here. And after lunch, he's going to come here and speak to the party workers. I've been with Mr. Wilson for the past 3 weeks, and I'm not surprised that he's quite cheerful about the outcome. He was hoping, I think, for an overall majority of about 20, but I have a feeling that he thinks his job will be a lot easier if he has a majority of perhaps only 7, rather than the massive 100 or so that was being forecast late last night. But we hope that when he does arrive here, we shall be able to have a word with him. From Transport House, this is Keith Graves.
At Conservative Party headquarters, we're waiting for Mr. Heath to arrive, probably sometime later in the afternoon from his home in Wilton Street. He'll be waiting for the results from the shires to come in to get a fuller electoral picture for him to comment on before he's going to commit himself. Meanwhile, the people arriving here this morning have been the party workers at a rather lower level. They've been disappointed, of course they have, by the defeat, but not totally dispirited. The feeling is it was a very difficult campaign for them to fight, and under the circumstances they did remarkably well. As for the inquest, the recriminations, possibly questions about the leadership, they're much more likely to get an airing today in your hothouse of a studio than here with the party itself. Martin Bell, Conservative headquarters.
Well, it's beginning to rain here on the Liberal headquarters in the National Liberal Club, and that jives pretty well with our mood. The Liberals here, the people who actually organised the party's election campaign, accepted early last night that the breakthrough just hadn't happened. But that doesn't mean they think the situation's hopeless. They have two main hopes of the future. First, that Labour will get a small majority, and they'll once more increase their power and influence with every by-election they win. That's what you might call their tactical political hope. But they have a strategic hope too. They still hope that they'll get enough votes this election to pressure the other parties to agree to a change in the electoral system, to agree to a system that would allow the Liberals enough seats in Parliament to match their vote in the country. Mr. Heath, during the campaign, said he would recommend a Speaker's Conference on electoral reform. The Liberals don't know what Mr. Wilson thinks. But now this election's not gone right for them, that's what the Liberals here are hoping now. Richard Wakely on the balcony of the National Liberal Club, London.
And I think we have a chance now of showing the total vote so far. Richard Wakely was talking there about the big Liberal vote and the electoral consequences of that, particularly if Bob has his way, and so does Jeremy Thorpe. Let's have a look at the vote. So far, Labour, 9.5 million. Conservatives, just under 8 million, Liberals, just under 4 million, and others, 1 million. That will be chiefly, of course, the nationalist vote.
But that will change. The Liberal vote will go up to 5 million, and the Conservative vote will come fairly close to the Labour vote, but Labour will be quite comfortably 1 million votes ahead.
Can I make it clear, Alistair, I've never publicly advocated proportional representation. I have said that the argument for looking at it seriously has grown apace and still remains very strong. So I would prefer it to be treated as a matter for a Royal Commission or Speaker's Conference to look at. But the idea that we should never look at it seems to me to be a bit undesirable, granted that all our European partners have some version of it.
That's very modest of you. You are a bit of an advanced man, I would say.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Thank you. I think Michael Steed probably has some comments to make upon this.
Well, we've been looking at the detailed way in which the Liberal vote has been moving. The swing has been very, very even. There have been very few constituencies where the swing to the Labour Party has been outside the narrow range of about 0.5% to 2.5%. But the jumps and the drops in the Liberal vote have been much more irregular, and they follow a distinct pattern. The average drop in the Liberal vote is about 3.5%. But if you look at the key marginals, the seats where Tory or Labour was about under 1,000 votes ahead last time, the drop is 5.5%. I think this supports Humphrey Taylor's feeling that a number of Liberals in these key marginals went back to their major party at the last minute, and it does look as if a few more of them went back to the Conservatives than to the Labour Party. The other group where the Liberal performance is different is those seats where they gained second place and came fairly close to victory last time. They haven't won any of those seats yet, but they have gone up in several of them. In Chelmsford, Bath, Chippenham, Leominster, Salisbury, Totnes and Westbury. Note that the names are very much in the West Country. The Liberal vote is up, the Tory vote is down. The Tory margin over the Liberal has been reduced by 2, 3, 4, 5%. And that must give the Liberals some hopes in 4 seats that are coming up today. Truro, which is in the West Country and therefore must be their best bet for a gain, Hereford, Skipton and West Aberdeenshire. I think the prediction of 11, which we're showing for the Liberals, which assumes that they will lose Berwick and Bodmin, which they will on a uniform drop in their vote of 3.5%, and assumes they can't gain a single seat, that is a minimum prediction. They could well go up to 12 or even 13. It's also worth looking at the Plaid Cymru performance. Plaid Cymru's vote is down everywhere. They've won an extra seat. They're up to 3 seats. So Plaid Cymru have done rather well out of the electoral system.
So they won't be demanding any changes. David, I think you were just looking at the Scottish national chances up there in northeast Scotland. Have you any comment from the results so far?
I gather that on the figures so far in Banff, which is just next door to Murray and Nairn, Mrs Ewing might be in trouble there. We just don't know what the personal vote is, but if Banff were repeated in Murray and Nairn, it would be just on the edge and might well be an SNP loss. We haven't heard from Clackmannan and East Stirling. I think the Labour Party isn't very likely to win it back. Aberdeen East, I think, and Argyll are likely to stay with the Nationalists. But there still is, and there are the chances the Nationalist gains in Ross and Cromarty, in North Angus and in Kinross. There isn't, in fact, much chance of the Nationalists taking any seat from the Labour Party. The Labour Party doesn't have, I think, seats at risk except possibly Caithness in today's results.
Say again. Well, there's a rundown. Of course, some of these results will be coming later on today, and we'll hope to be on the air for them, and no chance, as we were hearing earlier on, for a kind of result from Orkney and Shetland, and Argyll is another nationalist seat that's usually a bit late.
Now, Argyll counts on Saturday, because things come into the islands. Orkney and Shetland will come in late tonight, probably long after we're off the air, but it will come in tonight or past form.
And counting has resumed, of course. It began 9 o'clock or sometimes 9:30. There's the odd recount going on still at Plymouth Drake. And let's look at what Mr. Wilson will be hoping to hear from as he flies back from Liverpool to London in the course of the morning. Bosworth, that's Adam Butler's seat, the son of Rab Butler. Plymouth Drake, where, as we said, the recount has been going on. Braintree, that's Tony Newton against Keith Kyle. Keith Kyle, a Labour candidate who hasn't been at all well. He had a mild stroke during the course of the campaign. Buckingham, that's Robert Maxwell trying to get back there, and Beeston. These are the seats which Mr. Wilson hopes will tip into his column before the day is out to confirm that
I would agree that Bosworth and Plymouth Drake are ones where the odds are fairly even. The other ones, it's less, each of them, the odds are against Labour winning, though they might well pick up one of the 3 with any reasonable luck.
I mean, so far it's only Birmingham-Selly Oak, which is really out of line.
Yes. No, I don't think that Beeston is very likely to, on the basis of the adjacent seats in Nottingham. Plymouth Drake, we know, is absolutely on edge. Bosworth is down much more in the marginal area where most of the seats in that category have gone, but nearby Loughborough didn't show much of a swing, and so I think we might, it is quite possible we shall have no further Labour gains, which should put them down at a 3-seat majority.
Mr. Wilson is used to this situation coming back from the north, but perhaps he didn't anticipate this one. Certainly we didn't. early last night. The count, as I say, has begun in those places which didn't begin yesterday, and that particularly includes Northern Ireland and South Down. This is Enoch Powell's seat, and the counting going on busily. And Brian Walker is the reporter there.
Well, the count in Northern Ireland began at 9 o'clock this morning. There was no overnight counting, mainly for security reasons. We're expecting the South Down results sometime like 2:30 to 3 o'clock. The final boxes have just been emptied and they're counting the votes, but it does look as if the turnout will be something like 70%. That's almost 5% up on last time. And this would seem to mean that Mr. Powell, who is, of course, standing in Northern Ireland for the first time as a United Unionist, will get in all right, but he won't have a spectacular majority by Northern Ireland standards. Last time, Mr. Brian Faulkner, who was then making his final split with the Unionist Party and has since set up his own Unionist Party of Northern Ireland, encouraged his voters not, in fact, to vote at all. This time, he has discreetly encouraged them to vote for Mr. Powell's opponent. But this means that if there is an increase in turnout, it's probably going to be of Protestants, putting Mr. Powell in by something like 7,000. Clearly on the campaign, though, he has been rapturously received, although perhaps there have been some criticisms of the fact that he is a stranger. However, in the campaign, it looked to me, at least, that he had overcome them.
One of the features of the Reverend Ian Paisley's results in Northern Ireland is, of course, when they're announced. He's in North Antrim. He always gives us a bit of a song, which cheers things up no end. I wonder whether Mr. Powell will fall into that habit and give us a bit of a song this time. Perhaps he'd give us a little Greek verse, possibly. Now, Billy Flax, whom we all know for all his reporting on Northern Ireland politics throughout the past 5 or 6 very busy years, he's there in Belfast. Good morning, Billy. What news do you have for us?
Well, I think the main points of interest today, apart from Mr. Enoch Powell's position, of course, are for Manus South Tyrone, where Harry West, the Unionist leader, faces a very serious threat from an independent candidate, Frank Maguire, a Lisnaskea publican, who seems to have been able to mobilise a very considerable part of the majority Catholic vote there. Another very interesting result we're waiting for is that from East Belfast, of course, where the Vanguard leader, William Craig, faces 2 candidates. And, of course, it's a very great point of interest for the coalition, the Loyalist coalition here, that they do achieve a very considerable poll in this election, and not only that their leaders are returned, but they're returned decisively, because, as you pointed out earlier, there was a 51% United Unionist vote in Northern Ireland last time, and quite clearly the United Unionists want to push this well up because of the convention elections, which are coming along, probably early in the new year. But the 2 immediate thoughts of the United Unionists of the possibility of a small majority Labour government were voiced to me this morning by their leader, Harry West. He said that he said first that he thought it would strengthen the bargaining position of the United Unionists if, in fact, there was a small majority. But on the other hand, he said it mightn't be a good thing for the United Kingdom as a whole if there was a government with a rather shaky majority. Now, I think one of the things which the United Unionists will be doing at Westminster, if they have, say, 10 or 11 people there next time, is to press for an Ulster Grand Committee on the lines of the Scottish Grand Committee. They feel that, legislation during direct rule has had very little discussion at Westminster, and they'll want something on these lines. But on the other hand, a Labour victory as compared with a Conservative one has other implications for the Unionists. They've been pressing very strongly for extra Northern Ireland seats at Westminster, and the Conservatives have given what might be described as a half-promise to consider the possibility of extra Northern Ireland seats in the light of devolution throughout the United Kingdom. But I think these are just some of the thoughts floating about here in Northern Ireland as we wait for these crucial results. And now, back to London.
Sorry, Billy, before you go away, could I just try and put one question to you?
Yeah.
There were some hopes, weren't there, on Mr. Faulkner's side that Peter McLachlan might do well against Mr. Craig. You see no possibility of that?
Well, I don't think anybody in the 3 parties in East Belfast, foresees William Craig losing in this election. His majority, of course, might be slender. The interesting point will, of course, be whether, in fact, Peter McLachlan, Mr. Faulkner's man, or David Blakely, who's the veteran Labour campaigner in East Belfast, is runner-up. But I think, there's no real expectation that the Vanguard leader will be defeated. But his majority, of course, will be interesting from a psychological point of view and from a United Unionist general tactical point of view in this crucial run-up period to the convention elections.
It's curious that the parties which formed the power-sharing government in the Assembly, like the Alliance, Mr. Faulkner's party and the SDLP, haven't been able to agree particularly on candidates. Some people might think it was a pity that Mr. Blakely and Mr. McLachlan are competing for an anti-loyalist vote in Belfast East.
Yeah, there was a big bid, of course, in that constituency to get a united power-sharing candidate. In fact, the lead there was taken initially by David Blakely and then later by Oliver Napier, the leader of the Alliance Party, who in fact dropped out in East Belfast, and he favoured Peter McLaughlin. But the fact was that Labour people didn't seem to buy Peter McLaughlin, so there was a sort of problem there for the Labour Party, and in the end, David Blakely stayed in the field. But of course, this splitting of the pro-power-sharing vote generally in East Belfast is bound to increase Mr Craig's chances. But there are differences of emphasis, of course, on power sharing as between the pro-power sharing parties. I think this is one of the developments in this campaign. You see, the SDLP would say full executive power sharing and an Irish dimension, but the emphasis being put on it by the Faulkner Party and by the Alliance Party is somewhat different, and again also by the Northern Ireland Labour Party. So there are distinct divisions within what might be described as the broad power sharing field.
Well, thank you, and of course we'll be getting the results of these prognostications from W.D. Flax later on today. I think he's first class. He's much better than an opinion poll or a computer, and I expect that what he said will come out to be spot on. Now, I think, Robin, you have a chance of talking to Mr. John Davis, successfully back for Knutsford, I suppose, who's in our Manchester studio.
Yes, and I not only have Mr. Davis, and if he'll forgive me if I just introduce Mr. Brian Walden in Birmingham, Labour MP, and Mr. Robert Mellish, who is at the moment the Chief Whip. Now, Mr. Mellish, do you want to go on being Chief Whip?
No.
Well, that's the first time I've ever heard a politician say that. They usually say, whatever Harold Wilson wants me to do, I will do.
Well, you asked me the question, I'll give you the answer. I've had the job now for 6 years, and the kitchen sink gets very hot, you know.
Yes.
So I mean, you asked, yes, the answer, of course, if the Prime Minister says, well, that is the job, you've got to do it, words to that effect, I don't see how I can turn away. But there's a lot of talent in the Labour Party. They don't just have to have me as a Chief Whip.
Well, that's the trouble, there's so much talent, and where do they find a job for you other than Chief Whip?
Well, that's a problem, Robin, I'll try hard.
But seriously, whoever is Chief Whip, although you seem to be getting a working majority, it's not going to be easy, is it?
Well, it's going to be easier than it was in '64. Let me explain why. As far as I can read the figures, the Liberals and Tories combined will not, of course, bother the Labour Party on the assumption that we've got an overall majority, although slight. The only time we could be bothered if, in fact, there was an amalgamation of the Nationalists and Ulster Unionists and the rest, you know.
May I suggest there is another time you could be bothered on the question of Europe, on the question of the referendum, and on the question of the vote in Parliament as a result of the referendum.
Well, let's take each one in stages.
Yes.
I'm simply saying that where we were bothered with an amalgamation of Liberals and Conservatives before, we shan't be this time, at least I don't think so. We would be bothered if, in fact, there was an amalgamation of all the other parties. Then, of course, our overall majority then becomes terribly important, especially if we have the odd...
Its prediction is 7 at the moment.
7. Yeah, that's manageable. We'd have to find, we'd have to find one of those, of course, to be the Deputy Speaker. So that's down to 6 for a start.
Yes.
I think Parliament would have to make up its mind that we couldn't go on with the way Parliament is run at the moment. We'd have to change some of our procedures.
How long do you think you could go on, bearing in mind the common market problem and others?
Well, I'll come to the common market separate issue,
yes.
Robin, if I may.
Right.
How long could we go on? I think, first of all, and I hope Mr Wilson's listening to this programme, we can't possibly contemplate an election in 3-4 years. I don't think the public could take it. And I don't know any party workers that could take it either, and they happen to be very important in this argument.
I could take it.
Oh, you could, Robin, but you're sitting down all day. You don't do anything, really, except just talk.
Now, let's take that common market thing, because on the referendum, could be a number of your people who'll say no?
Not on the referendum.
Why not?
Because we are committed as a party unanimously to the principle of a referendum.
Do you see John McIntosh voting for a referendum in Parliament?
Yes, I can.
You wouldn't you allow a free vote on it?
I'm not sure. I'd like to answer that one when I got to it. But let's take the position of the Tories. Are you really then saying that they would vote against the people of Britain having the right to express a view? Are you saying that Liberals would, and after all, Jeremy Thorpe has said he's not opposed to a referendum as such. Certainly the Scots nationalists, they would vote for a referendum without any hesitation.
We'll bring you back into it. I'd like to bring in Mr John Davis, who was Minister for Europe in the Mr Heath's cabinet, and prior to that Secretary for State and Industry, and also Mr Walden. Mr Davis, what do you think about what Mr Mellish has been saying on the forecast of difficulties in Parliament under a small Labour majority on the common market issue?
No, I think certainly there are going to be difficulties. I should have thought that, from my own observation of the Labour Party, they're going to find it very hard. It's not as though we're going to just deal with a referendum as an issue of simple principle, and that's the end of it. It's a complex problem. You'll have to put forward legislation to provide for it. It's going to go through all that kind of parliamentary procedure, and I think on the way it's going to receive a number of difficult obstacles. I'm sure that's right. I think that, in fact, there will be need for the Labour Party really to try very hard to get its troops all together. They're going to find it jolly hard to do it, in my opinion.
Mr. Davies, if the Tories had fought a slightly different kind of campaign, do you think they could have won? Because they did much better than expected, but if they'd perhaps fought a more vigorous, more attacking campaign, they might have pulled it off.
Well, I do think there's, and I said so the other day, that I think that the idea of going for the national unity concept, the thought that we are in really such serious trouble, we've simply got to have a common purpose, is a difficult one to get over. People are particularly prepared for the kind of party dogfight in an election. They're surprised when you come forward with this rather different message.
Would you
I'm
argue,
trying to show it was the right message.
Would you argue, Mr. Davies, now that if Labour has a majority in single figures, albeit a majority, that they should moderate their policies and drop some of what you would think were their more extreme policies?
I think they'll be under very considerable pressure to do so. Of course, the House will exercise some pressure. There's another factor which has been very little talked about. Any government, not just a Labour government, in the course of the next few years, is going to have absolutely to win confidence abroad, going to have to borrow very extensively abroad. Once you start undermining that confidence, we're going to be short of money. As simple as that, I think. We are already, it so happens. And I think that, in fact, that will prove a very, very powerful pressure on the Labour government, in my view.
Do you accept that view of the matter, Brian Walden?
Oh, I don't, as a matter of fact. I think we do face economic difficulties in the next 2 years, yes. But I don't think that you can put it in terms of whether it will modify Labour policies or not. Labour's pledged to the manifesto, but what really counts are the tensions within the Cabinet. What the Cabinet decides is what the party wants.
Well, let me put this blunt question to you, Mr. Walden, whether, in view of the fact that nearly 60% of the people will not have voted Labour, can you say that the people of Britain, to coin a phrase, have given their full-hearted consent to a massive extension of public ownership?
Well, they read the Labour manifesto, or they read versions of it, which were even less favourable from that point of view. Labour has won the election. You're a great supporter, as I am, Robin, of the parliamentary system and the first past the post.
Yes, but you see, you're talking one thing on the common market. You say we've got to get the referendum and Parliament can't have a decision, and then when it suits you, you say, oh, well, it's seats in Parliament that matters. That's the way we run our democracy.
No.
You better make up your mind.
No, I don't think the Labour Party said that. I think it said that because the common market was a unique constitutional issue, we should do what all the other countries that are in it have done and have a referendum. And we will have a referendum, yes.
John David?
Well, I think that the referendum is yet to be seen, to my way of thinking. I've always thought, in fact, that it's a smokescreen. I mean, the truth is the Labour Party would find it very hard to fight a general election on a common market issue because they simply could not get a common purpose.
Do you agree with Mr. Mellish when he says we really can't have another, whatever happens, we can't have another general election for 3 or 4 years?
I think that's exaggerating. I should have thought that anybody who tried to put the British electorate to the test again in 12 months is going to get a fairly spiteful response. Anybody. But I think that's about my view, that it's surprising the recuperative capacity of this electorate, and I should have thought that if it's disappointed with the Labour government, as I think it will be, then in fact it will be ready for the fray again in 12 months' time and give them a good sock in the nose.
Bob Mellish?
Well, the one thing that emerges from what John Davis said is this. I do find it ironic. On the one hand, politicians have said, oh, well, they're all frauds. They come up with manifestos, and then, of course, they don't take any notice of that, and they just go sailing on doing what they like. We have said, from February, we have certain policies, we are determined to implement them. Now I'm told, oh, no, that's not right. You're saying it, Robin, as a matter of fact. Somehow we've got to start compromising before we even get office.
No, I was asking the question.
Oh, were you? Sorry, you fooled me. I thought you were saying this is what's got to be done.
I was putting it to them, giving them an opportunity to comment, as you can have now.
Oh, yes, you do it very well, Robin. No, but seriously, I must say that I find that Labour's determination to carry out its manifesto is to the credit of the Labour Party. This is the one thing that made my job as Chief Whip in the last 7 months in the minority government livable, because throughout the whole ranks of the Labour Party in the House of Commons was the understanding we were doing our very best to carry out that which we did in February, and I think it was our strength in this election.
But now, do you think that the people of Britain, by this election, they've said no to Ted Heath, it appears. They've given Harold Wilson a bigger mandate, but have they given their full-hearted consent to socialism?
Yes, to the extent that that which was contained in the manifesto. I agree with Brian Walden. We've not pulled any punches on this. I think it's been grossly overstated, some of the arguments about what was in the manifesto. For example, state ownership. The people who were shouting and raving about this, in fact, they couldn't have read our Partnership in Industry pamphlet. We have said in that certain basic industries, of course, we intend to state-own, but for the rest there will be a genuine partnership in industry, and I'd like to get this over to this morning. I think it's terribly important that a Labour government coming into power must deal immediately with the liquidity problem of industry.
Cash.
Cash. I think it must, at a very early stage, convey to private enterprise that we are willing and desperately anxious to cooperate with them. The best of private industry knows that state cooperation is essential, whatever government is in power, state cooperation. And I think the way in which this will emerge will be to see that, in fact, there is a much better understanding, and I think confidence has to be restored.
One final brief question.
Yeah.
Do you think that the translation of Mr. Benn to another post would help confidence and cooperation in industry?
I think Mr. Benn is an extremely able minister and will do the job for which he will be appointed, which is, I think, the Ministry of Trade and Industry.
I just want to give Mr. John Davis, in fairness, an opportunity to comment on the last part of what Mr. Mellish has been saying.
I think certainly, reverting to what I said earlier, that the disappearance of Mr. Benn from the Ministry of Industry would have a really tonic effect on international confidence.
Well, thank you, Mr. Davis and Brian Walden and Bob Mellish. And Brian Walden, I'd just like to put one thing to you. You were offered a job last time by Mr. Wilson. I believe you turned it down.
That's right.
Now, supposing he were reshuffling his cabinet because Mr. Mellish is going on strike and doesn't want to be chief whip anymore, would you like a job in that? Would you accept a job this time? You're a very able parliamentarian, if I may humbly say so.
It's very nice of you to say so, Robin, yes. But that's a hypothetical question. And
well, all questions are hypothetical.
No, some are real, and I find it difficult enough to answer the real ones.
How about chief whip? There's going to be a vacancy there, I think.
I wouldn't take that job under any consideration. And I hope Bob Mellish isn't going to be removed. I hope Harold is watching the programme, and my advice is keep him there, Harold. He deserves it.
I wonder if could we get Mr. Wilson anywhere just to comment on it? Anyway, thank you, Mr. Davis, Brian Walden, Bob Mellish. Thank you very much.
And Mr. Wilson, of course, will be emerging in Liverpool and going to Speke Airport, flying to London, as we've been told by Keith Graves, the Transport House, going to his home in Lord North Street, and from there this afternoon to Transport House. That's his programme so far, but no doubt Mr. Mellish's views and Mr. Walden's views and even perhaps Robin Day's views have been put to him, and he will be mulling them over. I think it's time for us now to go out and about. It was very pleasant to see a little glimpse of the North Devon countryside by the Thorpe Cottage. Let's go out towards the West Country, to Chippenham. It's a Conservative-held seat, has been in the past, although under almost constant siege by the Liberals in recent years. Julian Pettifer was at Cheltenham last night. I think Julian should be there in the cattle market at Chippenham. Good morning, Julian.
Good morning to you, Alistair. We're here at Chippenham Market, which is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, one-day market in the country. I'm talking to two dairy farmers, Mr. David Shoring and Mr. Dick Bailey. First of all, Mr. Bailey, what's your reaction to a Labour government with a small majority?
Well, I hope now that all the shouting's over and Mr. Peart is probably going to carry on as Minister of Agriculture, that he will honour his pledge, and that was that there would be a floor in the market of £18. The headage payment, which works out now about £2 a hundredweight.
You're talking about beef cattle now?
Yes, beef cattle, which is completely inadequate. The situation is becoming so serious now that the slaughterhouses are absolutely full of cattle owing to the winter approaching. The fodder situation is desperate in some areas, and it's going to react on the public in a year or two's time if confidence is not restored to the beef farmer.
Mr. Shoring, can you perhaps relate what's just been said to the prices that these calves are fetching here today?
Well, these calves not making very much money. In particular, the Frisian bull calf that last year was making £45 is now making between £5 and £7. Now, the reasons for this are, firstly, of course, as Mr. Bailey said, the beef prices are so poor that the beef producer just hasn't got the money to pay a reasonable price for the calves. But the disaster of it, of course, is that these calves that should be reared for beef are being slaughtered. It's no good Mr. Beard saying at the end of this month that he's going to put the price up. By then, all these calves are going to be dead, and he can't bring them back then.
Well, what, generally speaking, would you say is the farming community's reaction to another Labour government?
Well, we're not really too worried about that. Labour governments haven't treated us too badly in the past. But we must say now that it is a matter of urgency that this beef situation is put right very quickly.
I mean, people have even been talking about bankruptcies. Is this not somewhat melodramatic kind of talk?
Well, it's melodramatic if you're not involved, I think, but there is a real shortage of cash in the farming industry, and the beef farmer is really the worst hit because they're it wasn't one of the high profit areas ever.
And it certainly isn't now.
Oh my God, it's a high loss now.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you. And back now to Alistair Burnett.
And it's hard times in the fat stock market there in Chippenham, and a convincing story. One of the questions that must interest is whether there's going to be even leaner times in the stock exchange here in London. Esther Ranson has gone down to the city this morning, and I understand there she's talking to the vice chairman of the stock exchange.
Can't afford them. In fact, Alistair, I'm not, because I've got involved in a discussion here about whether, in fact, this election is making much difference to ordinary people who work in the city, but I have found here somebody who works for an Arab bank. Now, what difference does the election make to an Arab bank? Do you think they'll get more confidence in us now, or less? Or?
Well, I personally don't know. I'm not in a position to say anything, but I feel it's a terrible thing a socialist government's got in from an Arab point of view, and I think that confidence in a party that is going to carry out a full policy of nationalisation is something that I think stands out as being evil in their minds.
Now, there's a gentleman here who wouldn't agree with that point of view, would you?
No. I'm very, very pleased this morning.
Why?
Well, that Mr. Wilson has now, well, almost sure got absolute control. He's got a majority government, and all the bickering can stop, and he can start off afresh with a full government.
I have a feeling some bickering might start up round you in response to that. Does anyone disagree with that?
I think probably everyone does.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right, and there are some bad results. I think some left-wingers have got in and replaced moderates, which must be a very bad thing. Wilson certainly has got to change his tone on numerous things, I think, if he's going to govern the country at all successful. But I think he will change. Most versatile man standing on his head I can think of.
But I think coming on to that point, I think the Conservative Party personally have had a very, very bad leader. And I think it's about time he stood down in favour of someone with some new ideas.
I agree with that. Yes, I think he had a good leader, but some poor followers.
No, I think he's a very poor leader, and that's why the Conservatives haven't done well.
I think this conversation will go on for a long time. In fact, Alistair, I'm sure that you're having this conversation all morning. I hope it goes well with you. I think we'll carry on with this one.
But what bothers me is that we're told about all three...
Well, now, while Esther is continuing to talk to these city gentlemen, no doubt enjoying the morning, and it is a pleasant morning, I think we could go now to another view of the election result. The very first new MP elected last night was at Cheltenham, Charles Irving. Not that he was, in fact, winning the seat. He was inheriting the seat, but he is now going to the House of Commons. And at a light engineering factory down in Cheltenham, Julian Munter is talking to a worker there and also, I believe, to Mr. Irving. So, now, Julian.
The Doughty Fuel Systems factory goes to the aircraft industry. And so there's a possibility that if Labour goes ahead with its nationalisation plans, this factory will be, in fact, taken over by public ownership. Well, with me is the deputy convener of this factory, Mr. Ron Cripps. Mr. Cripps, what's the feeling here on the factory floor?
Well, I think quite a majority of them are in favour of nationalisation, and there are some that are concerned about what's going to happen, but I think on the whole nationalisation, proves pretty good for us anyway, the working side of the fence.
What's your personal feeling?
Well, I'm you know, a little bit apprehensive, but I think on the whole it would be a good thing.
Are you pleased with the result overnight?
Oh yes, I'd like to see a little bit larger majority, but I think there's enough there to work with.
Do you think if they get 7 or 8, they will in fact nationalise the aircraft industry? And do you think Doughty's will come under that?
Well, this is something we'll have to wait and see what happens. But I don't think they'll just rush into it. I think it will all be carefully gone into first.
Well, that's one view, and on my left here I have a management view, the Public Relations Director, and he just happens to be the new MP for Cheltenham. Mr. Irving, what's your view about nationalisation, the possibility of nationalisation at this factory?
I shouldn't have thought you need ask me, frankly. This has been a highly successful company, founded by Sir George Doughty, still in the seat of authority, a personal company where people work very happily. We all know each other, we get on well together with each other. We have very little industrial trouble indeed.
Nevertheless, there is some feeling on these lines. We've spoken to 1 or 2 people this morning who feel that the factory should be nationalised. Do you think perhaps the company could do more towards workers' participation? Do you think they should have somebody from the shop floor on the board?
Oh, I'm all for it, and I think it's a very good thing. It depends just how it's done, how successful it will be. But I'll tell you this, if you had a vote on nationalisation,
and Mr. Wilson now at Liverpool. He's just leaving. It looks like the steps of the Adelphi Hotel.
He's had about 3 hours sleep. And with Mrs. Wilson, off he flies now.
And I don't think you've got very much more, Michael.
Not very much more, Prime Minister, no, but enough to see you leaving. And off he goes now to the airport here at Liverpool to fly off to Northolt, and from there we expect the Prime Minister to be going to Transport House, and after that to Downing Street. So here's a small crowd. I don't know how much you can see of that as Mr. Wilson climbs for the last time today in this particular car, which he's been using to drive around his constituency in Huyton, which is one of the dormitory suburbs on the outskirts of Liverpool, and to which he was returned last night with his largest majority yet in the 24 years that he's served this constituency of Huyton.
Michael?
Yes?
Good morning.
Hello, Alistair, good morning.
I didn't quite catch what Mr. Wilson said to you as he was leaving. I trust it was complimentary.
I think it was, yes. It was not very remarkable. I simply was saying that he'd had about 3 hours sleep, and he said to me, "You haven't had much more than that, have you, Michael?" And I said, "No, I hadn't." So,
well, you both look rather well this morning.
I feel very fit.
Very good. And of course we'll
well, now, do you want to know what his movements are today? Because I don't know if you had time to hear them. He goes from here to Northolt, and after that he expects to go to Transport House to say hello to the party workers and to thank them. And then he'll be having lunch at Downing Street. And we believe that after that it's going to be a rest. I understand that he said he thinks everybody needs a rest after this. And a cabinet meeting, maybe Tuesday, maybe Monday, but not definitely decided yet. But nothing much after today's events and the Downing Street lunch. Everybody's going to have a bit of time off.
Well, thank you, Michael. Mr. Wilson, has he held any sort of press conference this morning?
No, he hasn't, no.
And so keeping distinct silence for the moment. Well, that was Michael Charlton there in Liverpool. Mr. Wilson on his way back to London and his programme outlined for him. And, of course, we'll be keeping tabs on him throughout the day. We should have given you one piece of news from the city. Esther was rather caught outside there discussing the result of the election. The serious news from the city, well, it's not particularly serious. The Financial Times index at 10 o'clock was down 1.8 points. It had risen slightly when it opened at 9:30. So the city is taking that too, probably with, one could almost say, no comment as a result of that. Now, I think we have an opportunity of going to Brussels again. Robin, I think it's Jack Peel in Brussels.
Yes, Jack Peel, the former General Secretary of the Dyers and Bleachers. Good morning, Jack.
Good morning, Robin. Nice to hear your voice again.
Well, I was going to say we miss you at the TUC and Labour Party conferences with your beautifully coloured shirts to advertise the craftsmanship of your union.
I've done the best I can this morning, anyway.
I've got a black and white set. What have you got on this morning?
Well, it's large yellow polka dots on a nice black background.
Oh, charming. Now, let me ask you, Has it been the view in Europe, as Charles Wheeler reported to us earlier, that on the whole opinion that he had spoken to in Europe wanted a Labour victory in order, as he put it, to end the uncertainty about whether Britain would stay in the common market?
Yes, I think this is a fair statement of the position. Here we're very frustrated, in fact acutely frustrated, at the way this argument runs on. And I think most people, apart from people like myself who wanted Labour to win anyway, wanted the issue out of the way. And I think the result will increase this frustration, because it now seems as if we have a stalemate period and that there will be great uncertainty and uneasiness. Now, I think we view the position with a little despondency here in Brussels.
Because there's less likelihood now of a referendum which would certainly get through the House of Commons and so on. This might be one of the issues on which a majority Labour government with, say, half a dozen or 10 seats overall majority might have difficulty, isn't it?
Yes, I think so, and I believe the statement by Mr Wilson that it will be a ballot, I mean, Mr Callaghan said this too, was made precisely with this election result in mind.
What's the view that you come across in Brussels, Jack? Is it that Britain is now a drag on the common market, or that Britain is more than ever needed in the common market to balance the increasing power of Germany in the community?
If anything, the latter view. I don't think people think Britain is a drag on the common market, but I think over here people are wanting Britain to play its full part in the common market. And speaking from my point of view, on the industrial side, for instance, I'm very anxious that the TUC should send its men onto our committees and contribute with their wisdom and knowledge to the work that we do. The same thing applies, of course, in Strasbourg. The Labour politicians are not there, so Britain's making at the moment an unbalanced contribution.
Jack, do you regret leaving a trade union job and going to the bureaucracy of Brussels?
Not really, but I'll feel happy when my TUC colleagues are working alongside me in Brussels, because, you know, I spent half of my life in the TUC, but I'm happy. And I'm now doing things that affect 100 million workers, which is the combined labour force of Europe, and not my 60,000 dyers and bleachers.
How's your French?
Oh, I don't speak it very well yet. Pas encore. Je commence seulement, mais je parle anglais et Yorkshire.
Très bien, très bien. Au revoir.
Au revoir, Monsieur Robin.
Well, I think there were 2 votes there for staying in Europe. They're doing very well at it. We should, I think, mention at this time, we are naturally laying some emphasis on the problems facing the Labour government as Mr Wilson returns to London. There are also problems to be looked at today and in the weeks ahead on the Conservative side. The rethink about policies, the Conservatives now having lost 2 general elections in a row. They've had difficulty in changing their policies, obviously, between February and now, but that is one of the points which will be taken up. Perhaps only second to that is the question of the leadership. I don't think anybody expects any sudden decision on that, either by Mr Heath or by any of his colleagues. Mr Heath will no doubt behave with great dignity and indicate that he is at the disposal of the party, but I have no doubt that the party will be given some time in which to make up its mind. And Mr Heath is a man of sufficient calibre, and those also at the top of the party have been so loyal and so devoted to him in the past that it may well be that he will be proving a difficult man to replace, even if that were the party's wish. Now, one of the matters which will come up in the discussions of the Conservative future will, of course, be the question that the party has still polled a pretty big vote in the course of this election, as indeed it had the major part of the vote, at least it was the largest single party in votes cast back in February. So how can the Conservatives convert that into a winning position again? Bob, what's the state of the votes at the moment?
Well, if you look at the state of the parties, first of all, Alistair, the top right-hand corner is fascinating. Remember at the beginning of the evening last night, we said that had to turn into a change in favour of Labour of 17 to get a bare overall majority. Well, it's 18, just over the edge. And there are perhaps 4, 5, 6 seats yet where Labour has a chance of increasing that lead, but it's very, very dicey. The Conservatives, having lost 20, they needed to get 21 or 22 to have a chance of an overall majority. Their position, therefore, is quite decisively out of the running in terms of forming a government at this stage. I think it's important, by the way, to add one thing that Mr Mellish brought out very well, I think, the fact that this is a marginally stronger position for Labour than in 1964, when in that Parliament the Liberals and Conservatives together were on the verge of outvoting him. This time the opposition will be more fragmented than in the Parliament of 1964. Let's look now at the share of the vote. Now, if you take the position of Labour, left-hand column, 42.3% of the vote, which represents an increase, if you look right below that, of 2.2%. Now, according to the computer, it's quite likely that Labour's share will go down from 42.3 because of the seats to come, 2/3 are Conservative seats. So I would expect Labour's share to go down to 41, somewhere between 40 and 41%. And remember, that is the smallest share of the vote that a majority government has had in over 50 years as it came to power. The Conservative position will probably strengthen a bit. You'll notice second column vertically, 35.5% in these 493 seats. That'll probably go up to 36.7, somewhere in that range, very close to what they got, indeed, in the election last February when they got 38% of the vote. But this will probably end up around 37. The Liberals, you see in the third column, haven't had quite as sharp a fall in their support as people might have assumed. It's gone down less than 1% in these seats so far. And that's the Liberal column, second figure down, you see. The Liberal share has gone down marginally. It's not the sort of rout that people might have been talking about. They've gone down, but not spectacularly. And the others, as you see, a slight improvement because of the Nat position. Alistair.
And Robin has got some new guests.
I wonder if I could just ask a question which is puzzling us here. I may be very stupid. We just said that 42.3% for Labour means an increase of 2% on their last time. And last time they got 37.1%, according to one table. I may be silly, but could you explain that?
Yeah.
Bob?
Sorry. It's the share of the vote in these seats. You see, what we've done there is to say that the share of the vote in these 493 seats is as follows. But I'm emphasizing that there are another 142 seats to come, and that will undoubtedly mean the Conservatives' position will change. That's the share of the vote in the seats so far counted.
Thank you for making that clear, Bob. Now, my colleagues here, Ian Waller, political correspondent of the Sunday Telegraph, Peter Jenkins, the columnist of The Guardian, Patrick Cosgrave, political correspondent of The Spectator and features editor of the Daily Telegraph magazine. Gentlemen, what are your conclusions about this, the effects of this small working majority, assuming it is a small working majority, on the conduct by Mr. Wilson of his policy in the Parliament? Peter Jenkins.
I think in a curious way this is almost the perfect situation for bringing out the very best in Mr. Harold Wilson. For this reason, he said in the middle of the night in his interview with Michael Charlton that he is the most experienced Prime Minister of his century in dealing with very small majorities. But in both previous experiences, the 1964-66 one and now over these last 7 months, he's dealt with very small majorities when he's been moving into an early election. He's been an electioneering Prime Minister. Now this time he can't do that. We just heard Mr. Mellish say that he doesn't think there can be election for 3 or 4 years. I think that's probably right. So Mr. Wilson has got to take the small majority and use it not to manipulate his party to a future victory, but to use it to lead the country and unite the country. And I thought from his very revealing interview in the middle of the night that he saw that this was now his task. And I think in a curious way it has liberated him from being the politicking politician and given him a chance to show that he is a statesman after all.
Would you agree with that and the implication of it, which suggests that Mr. Wilson would try and steer the government towards policies which the other side might regard as divisive or extreme?
Well, I think that, this is true up to a point, but I think it also has to be remembered that it isn't a cohesive opposition that he's up against. It's a very fragmented one. His actual overall majority of the Conservatives and the Liberals combined looks like being quite substantial. Therefore, I don't think there'll be any great impediments on the government for 2 years at any rate. I noticed that John Davis said a year, yes. Bob Mellish said 4 years for another election.
But leaving aside the parliamentary problem, isn't there going to be a tremendous pressure of public opinion to say nearly 60% of us have not voted for socialism, and we haven't given our full-hearted consent to nationalisation on a wide measure, and therefore, you know, take a middle road, please?
Well, how does public opinion act? Ultimately, it is Parliament that counts, isn't it? You say public opinion will put pressure on the government because it's only 60%. 60% are opposed to it.
Well, there are such things as by-elections.
There are by-elections. Well, of course, that is a factor the government would have to take into account.
There are such things. I don't know how long they'll last as opinion polls.
Well, judging by their present form, they're not going to last very long, are they?
Patrick Cosgrave, what do you think about the impact of this result on the way Labour governs the country?
I think there is no reason whatever, as Mr. Merish said earlier on, for the Labour Party in any way, in principle, because of parliamentary or public opinion pressures, to moderate or change in any way the programme they laid down in their manifesto. But there is an important factor which hasn't been mentioned so far, that in the present inflationary situation, there simply won't be the public cash to do certain things the Labour Party are committed to immediately. And there isn't the cash to embark on a great nationalisation programme.
But I'm always told, we're always told by economists that nationalisation doesn't cost money. You merely transfer things from one capital account to another.
Well, you see, I'm a monetarist, Robin, and I've always believed that inflation is principally caused by an expansion of the money supply. You can't nationalise without expanding the money supply. If Mr. Wilson and his government chose to do that, then they, the government and the country, would probably go for bust. I would in any event be surprised if we didn't have an election next year.
May I move on to a different aspect of it? May I put to you the thought that there are a lot of people thought that if the Tories lost this election, Mr. Heath would go, and a lot of political judges were passing sentence of political death on him in advance. Would you agree with me that in this situation, a narrow result and a very serious crisis, he's by far the most able and authoritative leader the Conservatives have got, and they'd be fools to get rid of him?
Oh, no, that's absolutely right. I think that you cannot, you must take a fairly crude and ordinary commonsensical view of this. He hasn't done at all badly. He's not been a very successful leader of the party. He's lost now 3 out of 4 elections. That's not a good track record for anybody. He's done not at all badly this time, but surely everybody will be a little bit weary now, and it would be better for him to go fairly quickly.
No, I disagree. What I was being told by some quite senior Tories just before the election was that if Mr. Heath lost by a landslide, he would go of his own volition and very quickly. But if it was a narrow result, as indeed it is, he would take some removing and he'd want to stay around for a while. Now, there will be some who will want to get rid of him quickly, but I think that I would predict that he would be around for at least a year simply because there is just no obvious successor to him. If there was an heir apparent, it might be a different story.
If you were a Tory, would you want to make a change? From the interests of the party?
Well, I think they've got time now to think very carefully as to who they should succeed him by. I would be very surprised if he were to lead them into the next election.
Would you agree, Ian?
I would. You see, I think what is going to happen now is we're going to have a considerable period inside the Conservative Party of thinking not only about leaders, but about policies. There's been this dramatic change in the last 7 months of direction. It hasn't been properly thought out. It hasn't really effectively appealed to the country. What the Conservative Party needs is 2 or 3 years in opposition to rethink their policies and work out things. I agree with Peter Jenkins. I think it would be unlikely that Mr. Heath will lead them into the next election, but let us say in 3 or 4 years' time, because there is undoubtedly a great body of opinion inside the Conservative Party that is hostile to Mr. Heath and critical of him. And but the ultimate problem, of course, is what policy the party develops and who to succeed him. And one of the great misfortunes of the Conservative Party at the moment is the remarkable dearth of talent on its front benches.
I simply don't think this is true, you know. And it's certainly the case, and has been for as long as he's been leader of the Tory party, that Mr. Heath has developed to an unusual degree the admittedly very large authority which the Conservative Party gives its leader. And he's been especially good at that. And that is why he looks a bigger, a more authoritative leader than one would expect from a man who lost 3 out of 4 elections. But that's been very much his own case. But the Conservative Party can't really work efficiently, in opposition or otherwise, without a strong leader. And there is no way in which Mr. Heath can be a strong leader for any particular period.
But who is the strong leader?
There is no... A leader, when he is chosen... Oh, I can name 2 at least.
Name 2 at least.
Mr. Whitelaw, Sir Keith Joseph. Both of them.
Not Mrs. Thatcher.
There are a lot of people in the Tory
party.
I'm a great
admirer of Mrs. Thatcher.
I'm a great admirer of Mrs. Thatcher. I think Mrs. Thatcher was the most intelligent and gifted member of the Heath cabinet. But I think when the time comes to choose a new leader, there will probably be only one candidate of what one might roughly say is the right wing of the party. And after Preston, after the Preston speech, that must be Sir Keith. But I'd just like to make the point that...
I think that Sir Keith Joseph, I mean, he's in the news now because he made this great speech and he's been writing to the Times every day of the week. There are many people a lot of people I've spoken to in the Tory party roar with laughter at the idea of Sir Keith Joseph as leader of it. I mean, he's a very clever man. He's got lots of good ideas and some bad ones. But the idea that he has the strength of well, really, sort of the mental physique to lead the Conservative Party. I think he'd crack under the strain. He's just not that. He's a very nervous, sensitive man. I don't think he's thuggish enough to be a good leader of the Conservative Party.
There is an element of truth in what you say. He lacks, as it were, the persona at the moment to be a leader. And so, in a sense, does Willie Whitelaw. They're both admirable people in their different ways, but if one asks oneself who, if Mr. Heath were to run under the bus tomorrow, which is probably very unlikely, who would succeed? Someone would have to emerge.
It would be Whitelaw.
And I think it would be
circumstances,
Whitelaw, in fact. And Whitelaw represents sort of the Butlerian tradition in the Conservative Party, which I believe, in fact, the great error that the Conservative Party has made, going right back to 1963, was to move away from the middle of the road, the one nation, the Macmillan, the Butler tradition, that saw them through very successfully in the post-war years.
You were talking, all of you, about, or you and Waller were talking about the difficulty of the Tories in reshaping their policy, but events are going to change the political scene, and it won't be long before there is something else to talk about except the three-day week and what happened then, and there'll be new events against which to measure party performance.
Yes, well, one very interesting thing, Robin, which we should perhaps consider is this, that Mr. Heath may yet survive to put his national unity rhetoric to some practical test. Because, for example, supposing the social contract is in shreds by next spring, and the Labour government finds itself having to introduce some sort of pay freeze, now there will be a revolt of left-wingers on its own back benches, and it will need Tory votes.
Possibly the resignation of Mr. Foote.
Yeah, it will need Tory votes to carry that. Now, is Mr. Heath going to, in the interest of national unity, carry such a measure? It will be interesting to see if that happens.
That, I think, will be a fascinating one. Can I just make one other point about leadership? It's always the case that when you're looking at the leader in charge of any party, that he looks bigger than his colleagues. But as soon as a man, or a woman for that matter, actually becomes the leader of a great party, they automatically gain an increase in stature. This is true in all democratic societies. So I don't think the Conservatives need to be bothered, really. There are, about who replaces Mr. Heath. Any leader will immediately gain an advantage. But I think Peter's got a very interesting point about what form opposition to this Wilson government is going to take. Now, if this is going to be a very socialist government, if it's going to try to do as many as possible of the things laid down in the Labour manifesto, then it will be essential. That event alone will drive the Conservative Party into a more conservative position.
But public opinion, for which none of you seem to have as quite as high, it seems to be
I have a great opinion of the value of public opinion, but not of its weight.
Public opinion may take unkindly to a Conservative opposition trying to bring a Labour government down.
Well, I think that's a very real risk, in fact, and certainly for the next year or two.
Thank you very much indeed, Alistair.
And with that discussion of some of the Conservatives' problems as well as the Labour Party's problems, I think we will be pursuing that theme in one moment. Mr. Wilson, of course, as we saw earlier, now on his way from Liverpool to London, and I think it's now generally accepted that his cabinet is likely to continue pretty much unchanged. Certainly very few changes if there are any, but one ought to keep very much in mind what Mr. Bob Mellish said there as Chief Whip, and of course he's been included in the cabinet. I don't think people say that without having some indication and some thought in their own mind that they've said the same thing to their Prime Minister. The other point, of course, which must preoccupy Mr. Wilson, and indeed Mr. Dennis Healey, the Chancellor, assuming that Mr. Healey remains Chancellor, is that Mr. Healey is pretty well committed to bring in a budget in November, and that is next month, so that the Labour government, the new Labour government, now has 3 or 4 weeks in which to decide whether it is going to reflate the economy, as Mr. Healey has perhaps suggested that he would do, or whether it's going to have to take other and particular measures to ride out what may prove to be a very serious storm in the world's economy. Well, now back to the Conservative problems. Martin Bell, who's been with Mr. Heath throughout the campaign, is now outside Conservative Central Office.
Well, it's difficult to know exactly what Mr. Heath's movements are going to be, but the party organisation here is starting to get itself together. Some of the party hierarchs have arrived, including the Director General of the organisation, Mr. Michael Wolff. My understanding is that Mr. Heath is likely to come here sometime later this morning or early this afternoon, and sometime after that he will be talking to us and giving his considered views on the electoral situation. But it's also probable that before he does that, he's going to want to get a much clearer view of how things have gone in the English shires,
where the Conservatives, of course, are expecting to get a lot of MPs returned. So we'll have to wait for a few hours, I should guess, before we have Mr. Heath's final views on the way the campaign has gone.
And meanwhile, everybody else is free to give their views, I have no doubt. Now, I think there's a possibility to look ahead at what we have to expect coming in the next few hours, particularly Mr. Wilson's hopes and possibly some of the remaining hopes of the Nationalist Party in Scotland. Michael Steed, can you guide us through some of these hopes now?
Yes, there is now a very select group of seats where the Labour Party can hope to make a gain today. Top of the list is Plymouth Drake, where we know there to be a recount, and Plymouth Drake is a toss-up, therefore. Bosworth and Beeston, both of them, we think Labour's got about a 50-50 chance of gaining. Buckingham, Braintree, Hendon North and Monmouth, well, these are all very much outside chances, all above the swing, the average swing that we've been seeing, but there was an above-average swing in Cardiff, and Monmouth is next door. There has been an above-average swing in some outer London seats, and Hendon North is an outer London seat. So, at the moment, on the computer, we're expecting a net Labour gain of 2 out of these seats. But in Scotland, of course, the Tories are also facing the problem of defending seats against the SNP. Ross and Cromarty must now be regarded as a probable SNP gain. The SNP have already taken 4 seats from the Tories. We think they will take Ross and Cromarty. Angus North is very much a toss-up. They've taken Angus South. Kinross and West Perthshire, well, I think that's an outside chance, although the SNP have already taken East Perthshire. The Liberals have also a few chances today. Truro is probably their best chance, perhaps a 50-50 at best, and right outside chances in Skipton, Hereford and West Aberdeenshire. Finally, the Tories do have some chances of further gains. They've already taken 1 seat, Hazel Grove. I think they've got about a 50-50 chance on results so far of taking either or both of Berwick and Bodmin, and a far outside chance, as David Butler's already mentioned, of recapturing Murray and Nairn.
Well, I wonder whether any odds are being given about this, Michael.
Well, I've given 50-50 odds on the seats. I think are about 50-50.
Well, you're not being adventurous yet, have you?
Man, you talk in betting terms, we talk in percentage probabilities.
Well, one should also mention, of course, there are probably going to be some changes in Northern Ireland. The SDLP has... Well, we haven't had any results from Northern Ireland yet, but it's got at least a 1 in 3 chance, perhaps a 50-50 chance of getting Mid-Ulster, and Fermanagh and South Tyrone might also go to a Republican.
Yes, a Republican who has, of course, been interned in the past, and therefore I imagine that his views perhaps might not be wholly in accord with the Westminster Parliament when he got there.
Well, I understand that during the campaign, Mr Maguire in Fermanagh and South Tyrone has not been seen. He's just been campaigning quietly in the background among his friends.
That's
a very different sort of electioneering in Northern Ireland.
One way of doing it in Northern Ireland. This is one of the seats that we're waiting to hear from is, of course, in Hendon North today, and Michael Cockrell is out there, and this is an opportunity just to take a little trip up to North London. Michael.
Good morning. Good morning, Alistair. Well, here at Middlesex Polytechnic, a number of people are gathering to wait for the result. At 4 seats here, only one of which is marginal, and that is Hendon North. That would require a swing of about 3.2 to Labour, which is rather more than has been happening at the moment. The other 3 seats are held by former Conservative cabinet ministers, Mrs Thatcher, Mr Maudling and Mr Peter Thomas. This is Michael Cockrell in Hendon.
And Mr Peter Thomas, of course, the former Secretary of State for Wales, although sitting now for that seat in London. Some words from the financial world, if we're not going to be given any betting odds by Michael Steed. The pound is up slightly this morning to $2.3330. On the stock market, as we said earlier, the Financial Times index is down 1.8 after an early rise. The fall is particularly marked in the bank shares so far. Gilts are up slightly. So if you are interested in these affairs, that will give you the first indication of what majority Labour government is likely to be. There's one point that I should make now about the figures there, the particular state of the parties so far. Labour 294, Conservative 185, Liberal 5, which are there behind me. We are including in the Conservative total there of 185 the Speaker's seat, Mr Selwyn Lloyd's return in the Wirral. I think this is perhaps not unjust insofar as Mr Lloyd has been opposed rather against tradition, but I suppose in keeping with modern and advanced thinking by both the Labour and Liberal parties in his seat. Normally, speakers are not opposed by serious parties. On the other hand, it is a factor to keep in mind when it comes to Labour's ability to organise the House of Commons successfully. If Mr Lloyd continues as Speaker, that of course will be one vote subtracted from the Conservative side. Now, Robin, I think, has got with him some representatives from industry. I recognise Don Ryder, Clive Jenkins and Peter Parker.
And Peter Parker is chairman of the Rockware Group, and perhaps unusual among industrial tycoons. He's a supporter of the Labour Party, and indeed has been frequently mentioned as a possible head of Labour's proposed National Enterprise Board. Are you a candidate for that post, Peter?
I've not had any contact about it at all, Robin.
Would you refuse it if you were offered it?
I'd like to know what the proposition is.
I bet you'd like to know what the salary is, too. You turned down the British Railways because they didn't offer enough, didn't you?
Oh, no, I was standing, Robin. Oh, you know better than that, Robin.
We'll leave that. I'm only pulling your leg. It's only pulling your leg. And Clive Jenkins, sitting uneasily between two bosses. Clive Jenkins of the Associated Society of Technical and Managerial Staff.
Near enough.
Put it correct.
The Association of Scientific, Technical and Managerial Staffs, which is now, of course, looking to a very confident Labour government. And after all the pro-common market conspiracies that you've been leading this morning in this studio, may I say, I believe there's going to be a referendum.
Just before you say what you believe, I want to introduce Sir Don Ryder.
I still believe there's going to be a referendum.
Guy Jenkins, as last, has got on the TUC, but Sir Don Ryder, who is chairman and chief executive of Reed International and who owns, amongst other things, the Daily Mirror.
Yes.
Who fought a strong campaign for Labour. Is that in accordance with your own views?
I think it's very necessary that we have an overall majority party leading us in this terrible time of crisis. One of the things at the moment, of course, certain words in the British language get so overused. Crisis is now a word that people accept. Very few realise the enormity of the crisis we're in at the moment.
Mr. Harold Lever spoke of devastating results on our whole standard of living if we didn't get, in particular, the international problems right in connection with oil and so whatever a Labour government does at home.
Well, of course, the international problem far outweighs anything we can do at home. But let's stay at home for a moment. Unless industry is successful, forget all hopes of schools, hospitals, standards of living. We've got to have a successful industry.
But have we got the majority which a government needs to do the decisive things that you want to see done?
Oh, absolutely. I think Harold Wilson did a masterly job when he had a majority of 3, and I'm quite confident. And also, I think the figures are very misleading, you know. I can't see Scottish nationalists and others like that voting against the Labour government in issues that are concerning the industry of this country.
Peter Parker, would you think there was a case with this narrow result for a Labour government to what is said, as it is said, moderate its policies?
I think what we need now is a government that has a plan. This plan has been made perfectly plain now in 2 elections, really. We know what they want to do. I would have thought they ought to get on and do it. I think firmness will produce the right response from industry. One thing I am very keen about, Robin, is that as the details of the plans come through, and we're not clear about those, that there is really a much more careful way of consulting with industry as a whole. I don't honestly feel the mechanisms for consultation between an active government and industry. I don't think that interface is right.
Do you think industrial confidence and goodwill towards the government would be enhanced if Mr. Wedgwood Benn were put in another post?
Now, I think Wedgwood Benn's proportion in this election has been seen within the whole span of Labour Party policy. I wouldn't exaggerate the Benn issue. I think that the election hasn't either. One stuck, really, to see the whole span of talent that Wilson has to play with.
A lot of businessmen wouldn't take quite such a tolerant or...
No, but now let the dust settle, Robin. Let's have a clear look at what the proposition is.
I think that Tony Benn has been a gifted minister, and I think we'll be quite clear. He has immense respect amongst people in the party and in industry. And very many managers of industry are anxious for his continued support. I look forward to a National Enterprise Board. I want to say this as well.
You might be on it.
Well, I
Jobs
think
for the
that,
boys, perhaps.
Well, I've no idea what you're going to get. Minister of Information.
But Robin,
I mean, on behalf of the common market.
This is not a government of national unity.
Could I make it absolutely clear? This government has a majority enough and to do all of the things it has promised.
Even the common market?
Absolutely.
What about the Labour Europeans?
What about the Labour Europeans? There'll be a special party conference, there'll be a party line, and we'll be out of the market. I say that flatly.
You take a bet?
Yes, I will.
How much?
What about a fiver?
Yep.
What odds are you going to give me? I mean, you're an European fanatic.
3 to 1 in favour of our staying in the common market.
All right, within then 18 months.
Well, staying in.
Well, you've got to give a limit.
Don Ryder.
Robin,
3 to 1.
We must get signed.
You're taken.
Robin, at this moment, this is quite irrelevant.
Yes. Right.
You've got industry absolutely rushing towards bankruptcy.
Yes.
Inflation, cost of working capital, stocks and so forth. Immediate action is needed.
What action?
Money has got to be provided for many, many companies in this country.
How does the Chancellor do that?
It has got to be done, obviously, because you can't raise it in the city, you can't raise rights issues, debentures, it's got to be government money, but action has got to be taken fast.
Do you mean a cut in tax or cash grants?
There's got to be a whole battery of things. To start with, you know, advanced corporation tax, that's got to be reversed. Many companies are on the precipice.
Price control ease.
Price control ease if necessary. We cannot have major companies going to the wall at this critical time in our history.
What happens to the wage restraint, if any, if the price control is eased?
Wage restraint, of course, we're not...
Mr. Wilson was saying if the rogue employers give too big wage increases, then we'll have to, you know, watch the prices.
But that's got nothing to do with the moment of this great liquidity crisis that 90% probably of industry is facing.
You know, that's what I meant. Get the dust settled after this election. The barking dogmas of right and left, honestly, for the industrialists, are irrelevant to the crisis we're in. The illiquidity is paralyzing the private sector at the moment.
You say dogmas are irrelevant?
The barking dogmas, the extreme views about industry are irrelevant to the problems that industry are facing.
Won't that remark find an echo in the hearts of those who believe that nationalisation is a dogma and ought to be put out of sight at this moment of crisis of confidence?
Look, for the first time ever, Robin, let's get it absolutely straight. For the first time ever in my experience, we have a Labour government actually saying it believes in a mixed economy. It wants an alert and vigorous private sector. That's a tremendous advance. I don't think this government is trying to destroy the private sector. It knows that's where the profit has to be made. That's where the exports are coming from.
I don't think nationalisation is a dogma. You must remember the Conservative Party had to nationalise Rolls-Royce. I make one point.
The nationalisation as a principle is a dogma.
Oh, do you think so?
Conservatives nationalised Rolls-Royce out of necessity, not out of principle.
Oh, no, I would have thought that was a vulgarisation of the argument.
It's the truth, though.
No, certainly not. I believe that if national money is going into companies, we ought to have a share of them. And I do say that is a principle. It's not a dogma, but it's a principle.
But that's not the only principle of nationalisation.
Well, I think workers' participation in management we ought to have had in nationalised industries. I think they have been disastrously bad in their industrial relations.
Do you support Sir Don Ryder's call for urgent measures of the kind he suggests to stop industry sliding into total bankruptcy?
Yes, there must be a battery of measures, certainly, and I have no doubt that we will see a budget within this year which will bring forward all sorts of fiscal instruments to deal with the problem.
Does that mean you think Dennis Healey was wrong in his budgetary measures earlier in the year, which some industrialists believe hit industry too hard?
No, I don't think he was. The problem was getting all of the industrialised economies to march together. And I think what he did in Washington last week has been underestimated. If they can march together in reflating, then I think we can avoid the difficulties.
Could we get away from the political football of nationalisation and look at it sensibly and rationally? I have said just now that the money for industry cannot be forthcoming from the city. And over above tax helps and things like that, positive cash will have to come from government into many companies. That cash is taxpayers' money. Now, what is wrong if government taxpayers' money is put in to government in turn saying we'd like a 10% stake, a 15% stake? I've never known any harm or hindrance.
But that, of course, is much less than control,
Just a moment. I have never known any harm or hindrance to British Petroleum because the government through the great wisdom of Sir Winston Churchill, took a stake in that company. Now, let's be sensible about this.
Are you advocating 51% holding in all companies which get government money?
I'm not advocating anything like this at all. I'm just saying, isn't it reasonable if taxpayers' money
Robin
goes
is
in...
an extremist.
Yeah,
He's an extremist.
No, I'm trying to get you going.
No, isn't it reasonable if taxpayers' money goes in that some stake is there? Now, let's go to extremes. Let's make this a political football. Right. Let's be sensible.
Final word, Peter Parker.
Robin, and I think one of the first things one ought to perhaps ask Harold Wilson to think about is to gather all the partnership of industry. That is the employers, the TUC, the private sector, the public sector, the new consumer organisation, and form them almost as an emergency standing committee to consult with them. We have so much change to face. We've got to create that appetite for change in industry. And consultation on a much bigger scale, a much more imaginative scale, is what we need.
Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen, for responding to my moderate and humble questions.
Crackle bang pop is day at the morning, isn't he?
And now for a no in the referendum as well. Everyone should vote no in the referendum.
Yeah, day hasn't broken.
And over these outraged voices, of course, we can provide plenty of those, and we always have Robin here to stir them up. More advice from Mr. Wilson on his way down back to London to resume government. And here's the state of the parties confronting him. We're waiting now, of course, for the first results to come in today. At the moment, Labour has 294 seats, a net gain of 18. Conservatives, 185, a net loss of 20. Liberals, 5 seats, a net loss of 1. And the others we can't discuss because there are too many people winning and losing in there in the Scottish Nationalist, Welsh Nationalist and Independent and Social Democratic parties as a whole. As I say, we're waiting for the first results to come. We have some hopes now of Finchley. That's the seat of Mrs. Margaret Thatcher, sometimes mentioned as a possible successor for Mr. Heath, and generally said to be the proponent of the one piece of Conservative policy, the 9.5% mortgages, that commitment which got through to a certain part of the electorate and may indeed have played some part in slowing down the Labour swing in those seats where Mr. Wilson might have hoped to have picked up a bigger majority given the national swing so far. Well, now Bob is standing in the middle of the battleground like Napoleon. What is your comment at the moment?
Well, it's worth reminding ourselves of how solidly Labour has held its marginals. You notice all these check marks are the marginal seats in Labour territory they've held successfully. Now, the national swing is just over 2%, and you'll see how uniformly Labour has made its gains in these very narrowly held Conservative seats, with the Conservatives counterattacking effectively here, holding this list, which they might have been expected to lose along with these others, and now we're waiting for absolutely key places like Bosworth, here, like Braintree, and places where the Labour tide, if we are to have a really clear working majority, ought to be picking up these remaining places. Labour jumped ahead in one case, Birmingham-Selly Oak, getting more than you'd have expected on the uniform national swing of just over 2%. But this is why the remaining results now are really terribly exciting, because the computer's talking about a 6-seat overall Labour majority. If they're going to improve on that, they've got to knock off some of these remaining seats that are to come in the next hour or so.
And, well, we are hoping for these results. We can't be an election programme without results for very long, and we are now just hoping that we'll get into the pre-lunch session with some returns. Of course, on the second day of an election, there isn't quite that incentive to be racing to be first. Again, there isn't quite that incentive to get the count over and go home to bed. You've settled down for a fairly long day and a chat with your friends, and after all, who knows, it is a day off work, paid employment, of course, for local government officials, the bank clerks, and so on. Now, David, in the elections so far, how would you say that the two-party system stood in England? Has it really recovered much of the ground that it lost in February?
Well, in the sense that the Liberals have fallen back a little more than the percentage of the vote suggests, because they were fighting virtually every seat, and they were dropping back in the seats almost everywhere compared to their vote last time. But the two-party system is still obviously predominant throughout England, and indeed throughout most of Wales, because the Welsh nationalists, in fact, except for the 3 seats they've got, aren't anywhere near to getting seats anywhere in Wales. So in England and Wales, you could say we have a predominantly two-party system with a limited number, 30 or 40 exceptions, where another party comes second.
Although about 20 to 25% of the people will appear to have been voting for third or fourth parties, which in our post-war standards until February is a very high proportion indeed. It's between a fifth and a quarter of the population voting for other than two big parties.
Well, now, why do you think the Liberal vote has gone down this time?
My own guess on this is really that a lot of Conservatives will have been found to have gone back to the position that they had before February. In other words, that I think undoubtedly many Conservatives took a flutter on the Liberals, assuming their party was home and dry according to the opinion polls in February, and many of them must have come back, I think, on that basis. That would be my guess as the most important single factor in the decline of Liberal support.
Because there is always, I think, a section of British opinion which is to vote against the party which looks like getting too big a majority. And this may also be another kind of floater who has gone to the Conservatives at this moment.
Yes, and I think it was assumed on the basis of the opinion polls that there'd be a huge Labour landslide, and this, therefore some people probably resisted it by coming back to the
The
Conservatives.
evidence is that by and large the Liberals were taking their votes relatively evenly from both parties, though there may have been a little difference in the key marginals on that, where they sort of seem to have switched back to the party that was the incumbent party, whether it was Labour or Conservative. But by and large, Liberal intervention, once again, seems to have hurt both parties relatively equally.
Well, now let's look at some of the MPs, former MPs, who, because the swing back to the Conservatives, for whatever reason, was not as strong as they would have wished, are this morning facing a future not in the House of Commons. The list is headed by Mr. Tom Boardman, a former senior Conservative minister, Chief Secretary of the Treasury, Mrs. Peggy Fenner, who was a consumer watchdog, Price's watchdog for Mr. Heath's government in its final phases, Edward Milne, who was the independent up in Blyth in Northumberland, who fought against his local Labour Party machine and won in February, but not this time, Dick Taverne, a similar situation for him in Lincoln, held his seat in February but lost it this time, Sir Harmer Nichols, who's lived through all the years on a knife edge in Peterborough, and he is gone, I think partly because of population changes there, people moving to Peterborough from London. Lord Balneil, former Conservative spokesman both on defence and social services, he was at one time appeared to have a very considerable future in the party. He has lost his seat. Edward Griffiths has lost his seat, and Michael Winstanley, that's the Liberal doctor up there in Hazel Grove. And what we have not put on our list is Christopher Mayhew, Mr. Mayhew, who left the Labour Party in July and went and fought in the Liberal interest in Bath. Now, I did say Edward Griffiths. You may not recognise the name Edward Griffiths, and it's Eddie Griffiths of Sheffield Brightside. And here we have Conservatives holding Plymouth Drake after 4 recounts. So that's one of Mr. Wilson's hopes gone. That, of course, is Miss Janet Fuchs, who went there from Merton and Morden back in February, took that seat for the Conservatives. It's a reconstituted seat. She must have had a pretty nervous night, but the count this morning puts the Conservatives back in again. Conservatives holding Westmoreland. And I think we just have an opportunity, Robin, to talk to Tom Boardman, who is now in our Birmingham studio.
And may I remind you, Mr. Tom Boardman was Member of Parliament for Leicester South until he lost last night, and a Labour majority of 1,133. Mr. Boardman, what was the most difficult thing you were up against in this campaign as a Conservative candidate? What was the issue you found stood in your way?
Well, there were certain local issues in Leicester. Immigration is one particular one. But on the national issues, clearly I failed to get across the dangers of the socialist policies, and the socialist, anti-socialist vote was split again so that part went to the Liberals. I believe the Liberal vote which came from Labour last time returned to Labour, but the Conservative vote that went to Liberal did not come back to me this time.
So your experience is, contrary to what David Butler suggests, that the Liberal intervention definitely helped to put a Labour government back.
Well, clearly, as far as my former seat was concerned, the Liberal anti-socialist policies and my anti-socialist policies, if combined, should have put held the seat for me, for an anti-socialist candidate, at any rate.
Was one of the difficulties you were up against, bearing in mind your particular part during the 3-day week as a minister, concerned with some of the issues at that time, were you up against the feeling that under a Tory government there would be a lot of industrial unrest and power cuts and so forth, and that therefore people had better vote Labour for a quiet life?
Well, that, of course, was the policy or the what was said by my opponents, and indeed what was put out by the national, on the national network by the Labour Party, that this was a danger. And of course it did stick, no doubt, in many people's mind. I did my best to show, as indeed the Conservative Party throughout the country did, how false it was.
Now,
clearly I didn't get that message across.
Our political... may I congratulate you, by the way, in being a politician who admits his own failure rather than blaming it on the stupidity or unwisdom of the people. But may I go on to say that our prediction is, at the moment, from a computer, is a overall majority of 5. Now, if it's something like that, what do you think, what effect should this have, in your view, on the government's handling of its policies?
Well, I would hope with a small majority like that it would drop a great deal of the more offensive parts of its programme. In practice, I don't believe that it will be able to do so, because I think that the more left-wing elements in it will insist that that programme be carried on regardless of the size of the majority.
Do you think if the Conservatives had fought a more robust and aggressive campaign, with the issues of February a little more to the fore, standing up to industrial power of the unions, etc., rather than the national unity campaign, that they could have won?
I think we were right to look forward and see what that we did want to unite the nation, or not look back and try to rehash the previous battlefields of February. What impact it would have made on the electorate, I wouldn't hazard to guess.
Mr. Boardman, thank you very much indeed. Alistair?
I think just one comment from you, David, on Mr. Boardman's view of what happened to his vote locally.
Well, I think, I don't know enough of the local circumstances. In fact, it seemed that it was more or less a straight transfer from Liberal to Labour, if one assumes that. But I think there were probably complicated three-way transfers. Our general analysis of the figures does suggest that the Liberals were taking their votes roughly evenly from both parties, or handing them back roughly evenly to both parties.
But that is the interruption, at least, in the political career of Tom Boardman, an MP since 1967. Now, some results. Here is Plymouth Drake, Miss Janet Fuchs, holding the seat.
A big swing to Labour, 3%. But this is important. I must say something on this one. It does seem to me that Plymouth Drake does change the scene. It was the best hope that Labour had of making a gain. They haven't made it. There are only 2 seats to come in which the Labour Party has anything like a 50-50 chance of making a gain. I think 320 seats for Labour is now the likeliest single outcome, which would be a clear majority of 5 seats. I would almost guarantee that it will be a single-figure majority.
So Mr. Wilson, then, on that basis, is now very much in the business of having to live with one or other of the smaller parties.
Yes, and to worry about by-elections.
And to worry about ill health. Well, it's going to be a winter, Bob?
Well, remember, there'll be a tremendous pressure on everybody in the House not to bring about an early election, right? We haven't stressed this enough. We've had now 5 elections in 10 years, 2 within the last year, and I think, therefore, it would be great odium on any group in the House who deliberately went out of their way to try to make it unworkable.
I think we've had it.
Well,
we've had that said so often. I must just put in one historic fact. We had 3 elections in 2 years, in 1922, 3 and 4, and the third one had the largest turnout in all the interwar years.
Well, that may be one way of getting the actual outright majority that everybody seems to be calling for. Now, another early result today from Westmoreland, Mr. Michael Jopling. That, of course, is very strong Conservative country, next door to Mr. Willie Whitelaw.
Drop in the Liberal vote in a new part of the country, just similar to other seats.
And while we wait for some more of the key seats to come in, nothing heard yet from Northern Ireland. Of course, there are very big counts in Northern Ireland. There are many more votes to be counted there. And we also await news from Scotland in particular to see whether there's any further progress coming from the Scottish nationalists, although their hopes will be open until a late hour. Well, now, Graham, David was saying he thought that Mr. Wilson might be coming down now to only barely an overall majority. What do you think?
Well, the computer confirms that, and our predictions and analysis give us at the moment Labour 320, Conservatives 276, Liberal 12, others 27. It was early last night, I think, when I suggested that, or rather early this morning, when I suggested the overall majority was not a certainty. Well, it seems that that was the wise thing to say, because it's just going to be there, but only just.
And that is a slight reverse for Mr. Wilson on his way back. But as everybody is saying, this is an unprecedented situation in Parliament. having had these two quick general elections with the return of very strong nationalist parties and no doubt 9 at least Ulster Unionist loyalists from Northern Ireland, the complexion of the House of Commons is no longer what it was in the more familiar days of the 60s and the 50s. So there is still a great deal for Mr. Wilson, still considerable room for him to manoeuvre. Just waiting for another result to come in, and this appears to be a Liberal gain in Truro. It looks as if the Liberals have taken Truro. That has just come to me, and that, if true, must set the cat among the pigeons down in the West Country. David?
Well, I think that there is a compensating Liberal gain. People have been saying how badly the Liberals have done. They've only lost 1 seat they were defending. They've now compensated for that. This was thought to be, in some ways, their best bet, because there was a large Labour vote to be squeezed, and there were signs that in the West Country the Liberals were not doing so badly. Michael Steed was suggesting it. It must give them hope of holding on to Bodmin, which is the most marginal seat they're now defending.
Well, now, if that Truro result, if we can get the confirmation, if we can get the figures, it would mean that Mr. David Penhaligon is a new Liberal MP and Mr. Piers Dixon a former Conservative one. But we're waiting for confirmation for that. There we have Mr. Penhaligon, who is an engineer. He's 30, a young man, and if it's true that he's coming into Parliament, he's coming into a pretty exciting one. We are waiting for some further results, of course, and these should now be building up from now through into lunchtime. But there's a little fillip for the Liberals and after a fillip for the Conservatives down in the West Country. And the computer prediction now, Labour overall majority of 5. And I think now Robin Day has been joined by Lord Hailsham. Robin?
And Lord Hailsham was described during this campaign in the Times in these words: his mastery of oratory and his almost mesmeric ability to hold an audience are undiminished. Don't you wish you were still in Parliament, Lord Hailsham?
I wish I was in the House of Commons. I am still in Parliament.
Yes, I apologise for the slip. I always forget about the House of Lords.
Oh, it still exists here now.
But wouldn't you like to be down in the mud and the flood?
Well, I hope that if I was down in it, it wouldn't be mud and blood, but I should enjoy the cut and thrust of the battle.
How about, just between you and me, and in this privacy of this room, how about promoting a bill to let life peers give up their life peerages to stand for Parliament?
I think people would see through that device.
Oh, I wonder what they'd see. Lord Hailsham, one of your great themes in this campaign, and many of your speeches have not been given the publicity which I think they merited in terms of their interest. You were hammering away at the Liberals. A vote for the Liberals will put the Labour Party in. Now, David Butler, who, as Robert Mackenzie says, is the Queen Victoria of cephalogists, says that they took it equally from both Labour and Conservatives, the Liberals.
I don't think this is completely true. David Butler, of course, goes round the world making false predictions on the radio. Last time I saw him, it was election night in Australia this year.
And what did he say there?
Oh, he was counting the ballot boxes in the wrong order, and he got the wrong result.
Did he say Whitlam had lost?
No, he said he'd won by an enormous majority, as far as I remember.
Being a fair organisation, may I bring David Butler in there?
Actually, I think Lord Hailsham must have been watching too cheerfully. I actually had rather a good track record on the Australian election. We did edge down from, I think, a majority of 13 seats to a majority of 7, which it finally was. But I don't think that was very much of a variation, rather less than we've been having on the results here.
Good on you, David, but I think there are more important things. Lord Hailsham, do you think that if the Conservatives had fought a campaign more of the kind you were fighting, rather than this rather muted campaign, that they could have won, bearing in mind how narrow the result is?
No, I don't think they can be faulted on this campaign. I regard a campaign as, so to speak, an orchestra in which different speakers play different instruments.
What were you playing
then? The trombone, don't you think?
You weren't blowing your own trumpet?
Not my own. I always borrow the trumpet from the team, you know. I'm a member of the orchestra.
You were beating the drum occasionally and a bell, if they have those in orchestras, do they?
The bell is mythology. The drum, perhaps, occasionally, I admit.
Do you think that those who are political judges who are passing sentence of political death on Mr. Heath are putting on the black cap a little too soon?
Yes, I do. I think they're basing their predictions without an adequate analysis of the situation.
There isn't anyone really to replace him. Were he thinking of going?
Well, it's not only that, you see. Let us look at the situation as it will be when Parliament reassembles. The first thing that an opposition does is to watch events. And if they have correctly predicted the course of events in their previous election campaign, that will strengthen the position of the leader. Now, secondly, Mr. Heath's position will depend upon his performance as leader of the opposition. If, in fact, it's a good performance, that again will strengthen his position.
You think he's on probation from now on?
Now, all leaders are constantly, it's like being the chief bull in a herd. You know what that means. I mean, there are always people pressing you from below and from the opposite side. But a leader of opposition is judged on his performance in Parliament, and that's what's going to happen. Now, the third factor...
Can I just interrupt you, Lord Hailsham? I'm sorry. I'd just like to tell you something which may please you, that the Conservatives have gained Bodmin for one of those Liberals you don't like.
Well, it's not that I don't like the Liberals. I regard the Liberal Party as a romantic fallacy. I very much do. Some of my best friends are Liberals, or have been, Robin.
I know what that means. But coming back to the point about Mr. Heath and the leadership of the Conservative Party, you think are you saying that the Conservatives in Parliament would be well to not think of any change at this time?
Well, they'd be very stupid to divide themselves. The tendency, the difficulty about opposition, which I'm quite an expert on because I've been in opposition quite a lot, the difficulty about Parliament is that government parties tend to unite. And opposition parties are always subject to the danger of disintegration. Now, the great thing about being in opposition is, first of all, you must keep your party together. And that is not going to be done by fighting a bitter war between rival leaders.
Do you see any hope from your point of view? We had some discussion earlier, and our journalistic guests disagreed on this, as to whether there would be any hope that the Labour government, with a tiny minority, would moderate its policies in the sense of dropping some of the policies which you regard as immoderate.
Well, I don't think that's an easy prediction to make. What I would say with much greater confidence is that the narrowness of the majority will tilt the balance of power inside the Labour Party in favour of the moderates again. It was, as Mr. Heath was saying and I was saying during the election, dominated by its left wing in the last 8 months. Now, I think that the result of this election is going to tilt the balance back in favour of the moderates, and we'll see whether that happens or not.
Thank you, Lord Hailsham, and may you continue among our leading political wind instruments.
Thank you very much for that compliment.
Well, now I think it's time to look at some of the results coming in from the West Country. First, the good news for the Liberals, Mr. David Penhaligon taking Truro.
And that is due to his taking votes equally from Conservative and from Labour. But it's worth noting that the Mebyon Kernow, the Welsh Cornish nationalist vote, dropped by 466, just 2 more than the Liberal majority. So he may have been in on a squeeze of Cornish nationalists.
And I think the good news for the Conservatives this time round, this is Bodmin, Mr. Paul Tyler, who had a majority of only 9 last time, and he goes out. He was an MP in February. He's unemployed in October.
His share of the vote, more or less unchanged. Labour goes down 1.1, Conservatives go up 1.3, and Mr. Hicks is back again.
Well, now, Mr. Robert Hicks, he was, of course, elected in 1970, and he was an assistant whip, a technical college teacher, and he was vice chairman of the National Young Conservatives back in the 1960s. And so he has recovered the seat in which he suffered a temporary interruption. Bob?
That's very bad luck for the Liberals, because Tyler is one of their upcoming figures, I think, and to lose him after a few months is really tough.
Well, that's how it is, I think, in the West Country now, because these seats do change hands. And here we have Mr. Wilson arriving now, I think at Northolt, or is it London Airport? Coming down, at any rate, here, arriving in London. It is Northolt. We were told he was going to Northolt, but one can't always recognise one runway from another. And Mr. Wilson arriving to the news that he still has an overall majority predicted for him, but it will be a narrow and a tenuous one, arriving to new problems and new opportunities. Mr. Wilson has made no secret in what he said to Michael Charlton last night and in his statements since then. no secret whatsoever that he believes the country faces a major crisis and that very stern measures are going to be needed and courageous measures to cope with it. One of these, the forthcoming budget, which must be in his mind. Second to that, I suppose, if there are to be any ministerial changes, that's one of the things that he'll be taking up this afternoon in his own mind and over the weekend. But his first job is to reappear, to thank the party workers at Transport House, and to get back to the job of government. So the steps are down. Mr. Wilson, Mrs. Wilson and their party will shortly be emerging to a Labour overall majority of 5 predicted, and just a slight wait, probably just getting hat and coat on, and here we come. We are just waiting for the Prime Minister setting up a political record, comparing himself almost with Gladstone yesterday, and here he is. Here he is now, Mr. Wilson. It seems quite a gusty morning, shaking hands and moving on back into his home at Lord North Street, Transport House, and his other home in 10 Downing Street. Mrs. Wilson carrying flowers, smiling. Mrs. Wilson is known not to enjoy electioneering very much, but of course she's gone through it particularly loyally. She it was who said that they shouldn't play the song, "Hello, Harold, it's nice to have you back where you belong," at the election meetings. But I don't doubt that many Labour supporters will feel that Mr. Wilson certainly is back where they think he should belong. And Mr. Wilson, smiling, couldn't be happier as they get into the official car.
That's Robert Armstrong, his principal private secretary, briefing him doubtless on things that have happened in the last 24 hours.
We are waiting for other declarations, and no doubt Mr. Wilson will be hearing of those on his drive into London. Just saying a word before he gets in. And Mrs. Wilson, I suppose somewhere at the back of his mind there's the memory of the car journey that he took from Liverpool back to London in 1970, the one time that he was defeated in campaigning for number 10. This time, all smiles. This time, still a clear overall majority. Lady Falkender, his personal political secretary, walking to the second car, and the group now preparing to drive south to Westminster. Mr. Wilson setting off. So that was a quick journey. Mr. Wilson used to favour coming down by train, and so our cameras then had to be at Euston Station, but now he seems to have taken to the air, seems to prefer that. And off they go. Well, we'll be keeping track of them when they get further into town. And we expect now some result from Hendon. Let's go over there at once.
They look as if they're about to declare here at Hendon South, which is the seat of the former chairman of the Conservative Party, Mr. Peter Thomas. The returning officer getting up now here at Hendon South.
Parliamentary election, Hendon South constituency. The number of electors voting at the election for this constituency was 69.84%. I, William George Hart, returning officer for the Hendon South constituency, hereby declare that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Colne, Michael David, Liberal, 7,404. Hadley, Richard Morris, Labour, 11,903. Thomas, Peter John Mitchell, Conservative, 16,866.
He's held the seat with a reduced majority.
And that Peter John Mitchell Thomas has been duly elected to serve as member for the said constituency.
Peter Thomas, the former chairman of the Conservative Party, former Secretary of State for Wales, and the former Minister of State for Foreign Affairs.
Labour push up into second place. Very much the pattern of results we've been having over and over again in seats of this sort with Liberals, where they just got into second place last time, dropped back now.
Your staff, and in particular, your acting returning officer, for the very efficient way in which the count was conducted,
So Mr. Peter Thomas back, and as a former cabinet member and one of Mr. Heath's advisors, former chairman of the party, he will still no doubt have many contacts through the constituencies. A result from Epsom and Ewell, another former Conservative minister, Sir Peter Rawlinson, safely back in his stronghold. Sir Peter Rawlinson, Attorney General, and distinguished Conservative lawyer, and no difficulty for him. He sits in one of the more comfortable seats in the London commuter belt.
Liberals still in second place, but the normal sort of switch, Labour up a bit, Liberals down a bit.
Well, that may be the pattern in other results coming from London, but there still seems to have been a little bit of mayhem down there in the southwest. We are waiting for results from Scotland now to see whether the Scottish nationalists can continue their advance. They made their advance yesterday, chiefly at the expense of the Conservatives in Scotland, and no doubt they are looking rather hungrily at 2 or 3 Tory-held seats there.
Well, now, 15 seats still to come in Scotland.
Now, Robin is talking down the line to Glasgow.
David Butler just said something at the end there. What was that?
He just said there were 15 seats still to come from Scotland.
Any winnable ones, in your view?
Oh, quite a number.
Which ones?
Well, I mean, you can go through the list.
Well, just tell us. The audience don't know from Adam.
Well, Ross and Cromarty, North Angus, Kinross and Perth. We've had all the... Here you have them. Those are the ones they have already gained, those 4. And there are the possible gains that those suggest. Ross and Cromarty, North Angus, Kinross and West Perth shows a less likely one, and Moray and Nairn as a possible SNP loss.
Thank you very much. Up there in Edinburgh, we've got John McIntosh, who won Berwick and East Lothian for Labour, Alec Fletcher, who won Edinburgh North for the Conservatives, and William Wolfe, who is hoping to win West Lothian for the Scottish National Party. We haven't yet had his result. Alec Fletcher, first of all, what's your reaction to the results in Scotland, bearing in mind, as Alistair Burnett has just said, the Scottish National Party made its gains particularly at the expense of the Tory party?
It's not a happy day for the Tory party in Scotland, that goes without saying. There's been a tremendous protest in the farming constituencies. Farmers up and down the United Kingdom have problems and are very worried. In Scotland, they're voting SNP. And unfortunately, we've lost several very good members as a result of this.
Don't you think you lost because your proposals for Home Rule didn't even offer the Scots an elected assembly?
Don't talk about Home Rule, Robin.
Well, you know what I mean.
We have Home Rule in Scotland today, just as you have in London. UK government, that's Home Rule. If you're talking about a Scottish Assembly or a Scottish Parliament, we put forward a very realistic proposal on the basis that you cannot elect an Assembly on top of the new regions. But realistic proposals are rather difficult to present during elections, and that may be one of the problems we're encountering at the moment.
John McIntosh, what's your reaction to the Scottish result as a whole so far?
My general reaction is that the Labour vote did extremely well, but I think it was very important that we did put a positive, understandable proposal on Scottish government to the electorate. I think the proposal for a directly elected Parliament in Edinburgh for Scottish affairs was comprehensible, and all the evidence, and however you discount the polls, we had 65% of Scottish National Party voters, or those intending to vote Scottish National Party, really wanted the kind of proposal we put forward. And as we drummed it in that this was a Labour Party proposal and not total independence, which was a different policy pushed by the Scottish National Party, I think we were able to hold our vote and in many cases do better than that and increase our position.
Do you think you'd have done better if you'd made your proposals for devolution a little stronger in the sense of letting the Scots have a chief minister as well as an assembly?
Well, I don't think this
like
is really...
Kilbrandon suggested.
I don't think, in fact, you can have a Scottish Secretary of State and an effective assembly or parliament in Scotland, because if you transfer decision-making power to such on Scottish health, housing, education,
wasn't that the objection to Labour's proposals?
Well, this objection was never put. Nobody was arguing this. The question was, were you for one of 3 things? Were you for total independence, in which case you voted SNP, and only a tiny proportion of the Scottish electorate is, or were you for a directly elected Scottish Parliament, which was going to handle Scottish affairs, which was the Labour Party position, which I think we put across very effectively, and the Conservative one, which Alec Fletcher says was realistic, just never got off the ground for a moment. They never peddled it, they never explained it, because it was incomprehensible.
Let me bring in William Wolfe and ask him whether he agrees that only a tiny proportion of the Scottish people believe in independence as advocated by the Scottish National Party, which appears to have got more than a tiny proportion of the vote.
But you don't get people just voting for what the ostensible policy of the party.
It's Mr. Wolf's turn.
Yes, quite, thank you. May I point out, though, that my seat was counted in the middle of the night and that I was not successful in West Lothian.
I'm sorry about that. I do apologise.
No,
An unforgivable error.
That's quite all
and
right.
I accept responsibility.
It takes a long time for some things to reach London. I know that.
Could we hold you for one moment? We want to come back to you, but I've got to go to a declaration.
Declaration here at Finchley, Mrs. Thatcher's seat.
Parliamentary election for the Finchley constituency. The number of electors voting at the election for this constituency was 69.5%. I, William George Hart, returning officer for the Finchley constituency, hereby declare that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Brass Lawrence Stephen Liberal, 7,384. Godfrey Janet, National Front, 993. O'Connor Martin John, Labour, 12,587. Thatcher Margaret Hilda, Conservative, 16,498.
Majority down by about 1,700 votes there.
And that Margaret Hilda Thatcher has been duly elected to serve as member for the said constituency.
Shadow Secretary for Environment, former Education Secretary, tipped for the Treasury spokesmanship and a star of the election.
Mr. Mayor, fellow candidates, ladies and gentlemen, with such little voice as I have left, may I propose a vote of thanks to the returning officer and all his staff for the very long stint they carried out yesterday, for the way in which they've conducted the count today, and also to the police for their never-failing good humour and benevolence on these occasions. I know that it will probably be Mr. Williams' last stint, if I might call it that, at looking after us during these counts.
And I think we have the result coming from Mr. William Whitelaw's seat at Penrith now. Let's go over there and hear.
Well, in fact, Alistair, we're not quite ready for the count here. We've been waiting for Mr. Whitelaw, of course, to come up from London. He's been flying up from the Conservative Party headquarters, where, of course, he's chairman of the Conservative Party. But naturally, he's also been travelling up to good news, because Mr. Whitelaw's held this seat since 1955. And there's no possibility at all that he'll be unseated here. But what will be interesting is to hear his views later on about the state of the parties at the moment. You can see him there on the platform, and any minute now, no doubt, the returning officer, the High Sheriff of Cumbria, Mr. George Wingate, will be making the declaration. But I think for the moment we should return to the studio and then perhaps come back here in a minute or two when the declaration is absolutely imminent.
Well, thank you, Martin. We'll do that. Mr. Whitelaw did look cheerful there. Of course, at the last count back in, well, it was March the 1st, he was suffering from a very heavy cold indeed. Well, now, Robin, I think we've just got a moment, perhaps, to finish your discussion in Glasgow.
And I think we're going back to my friends in Edinburgh, and we'll... there we are. Mr. William Wolf, I apologise for inadvertently suggesting that you were still hoping to win West Lothian. I'm sure that's so for the future, but you did in fact lose it, didn't you, by a majority of 2,690 to Labour.
Yes.
Now, would you please make your reply, which we had to cut you off on, about what John McIntosh was saying, that only a tiny minority of Scottish wanted national independence?
Well, most people don't understand the single-word terms used for various kinds of self-government. But if you go into terms of function, if you say, do you want people to have control over the resources, the financial affairs and the economy of the country, I'm quite confident that a majority of the Scots would say yes. And in a poll just before the election, it was shown that 75% of the Scots wanted Scotland to have representation in the common market. And they can only get that with a sovereign parliament, such as is proposed by the Scottish National Party. So I think there's still a tremendous education job for the Scottish National Party to do, to let people know precisely what self-government would mean. We've got it to define it in functional terms and let them understand what it would involve for them.
Could I just come in to John McIntosh and ask him on another aspect of the matter? You, of course, John, are a leading and, if I may say so, passionate European on the subject of the common market. Would you vote for or against a bill to set up a referendum in the House of Commons now?
Well, irrespective of my views on the common market, and I don't think they're passionate, I think they're just sensible, rational calculations of Britain's long-term interests.
But you speak passionately.
Yeah, well, possibly. But my point about this is that even if there was a majority of the British public in favour of entry into the common market and were clearly going to vote yes in a referendum, I would still object to a referendum because I don't like government by Gallup poll.
But will you
I
vote
prefer
against
parliamentary government.
Will you vote against a bill for a
I
referendum?
certainly will remain opposed to a referendum under any circumstances, as I think it in the long term damages Parliament, and I have a loyalty to the democratic system in this country. Incidentally, if you had this referendum, we'd have Mr. Wolfe.
John, I've got to go to Penrith Declaration now.
Thank you.
And Martin Young at Penrith.
Here we are at Penrith, and just about to have the declaration now from the High Sheriff of Cumbria, Mr. George Wingate.
Parliamentary election, Penrith and the Border constituency, date of poll 10th of October 1974. I, the undersigned, being the returning officer for the constituency above mentioned, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Pease, Joseph Gurney,
Liberal,
7,215. Weedle, Joseph Norman David,
Labour,
9,791. Whitelaw, William Stephen Ian,
Conservative,
23,547. And that the undermentioned person has been duly elected to serve as member for the said constituency. William Stephen Ian Whitelaw. The number of ballot papers rejected and not counted by me at this election was as follows. Want of official mark 2, voting for more than one candidate.
Mr. Whitelaw, chairman of the Conservative Party, a close colleague of Mr. Heath over the years, sterling service in Northern Ireland, where he was Secretary of State, and also as Secretary of Employment. So, Mr. Whitelaw, comfortably back at Penrith.
The second safest seat in the country for the Conservatives. I think it still is the second safest seat.
And just news that Labour have held Chorley, that George Rogers' seat there. It was Conservative in '70. It was the last remaining possibility that the Conservatives might take a Labour seat in this election, but it stayed in the Labour column. Bob?
Certainly, if Mr. Heath were to decide that having lost 3 out of 4 elections that he ought to retire from the leadership within the lifetime of this Parliament, Mr. Whitelaw, who's just been returned, would be one of the contenders. And also returned a few minutes earlier, Mrs. Thatcher could be one of the contenders for the succession should there be a change of leadership in this Parliament.
And now let's have the result from Hendon North. Michael?
Well, this is one of the marginal seats which, on a much bigger swing, Labour would have a chance of winning. They need a 3.2% swing. Turning Officer Butt to declare here at marginal Hendon North.
Parliamentary election of the Hendon North constituency. The number of electors voting at the election for this constituency was 72.30%. I, William George Hart, returning officer for the Hendon North constituency, hereby declare that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Champion, John Stanley, Labour, 14,549. Gorst, John Michael, Conservative, 16,299. Senior, Ian Stanley Temple, Liberal, 5,822. And that John Michael Gorst, has been duly elected to serve as member for the said constituency.
Held on to it with a slightly reduced majority there.
This is a very important result because it's the fifth most marginal seat that the Conservatives could still lose. They haven't lost it. They've held on to it quite comfortably. There are only 4 seats, I think, Labour can still possibly get from the Conservatives, and I think only 2 of those look much chance. But this does take one more uncertainty out of the picture.
Mr. Gorst, whom we saw just rising to respond to the returning officer, he's a career in advertising and public relations and very interested in local radio. Let's get some results from elsewhere. Halton Price, Mr. Patrick Wall, safely back in that seat.
One more part of the country where just the same thing happens, Labour up, mainly at the expense of the Liberals.
And the part of the country is just outside Hull. And Chorley in the northwest, George Rogers.
A rather lower swing than many swings in Lancashire.
On the south coast, Mr. Albert Costain, back as usual.
Liberal vote drops, but they still just keep second place.
And now from mid-Oxfordshire, Mr. Douglas Hurd, who was Mr. Heath's political secretary when Mr. Heath was in number 10.
Hardly any change at all from last time's result.
So the results are coming in. I don't think that so far they can bring very much encouragement to Mr. Wilson that he's going to have a particularly big majority. We have news that Eastbourne has been held by the Conservatives. That in the rather distant past had been a Liberal hope, but of course is now no longer. Well, now Mr. Jeremy Thorpe has got up. He also, like Mr. Wilson, is out and about. David Lomax, as we saw earlier, was down there at his cottage, and David spoke to Mr. Jeremy Thorpe for his views this morning.
Mr. Thorpe, why has there been such a general drop in Liberal votes in this election?
Well, I think there's been a 3 or 4% drop. I haven't yet studied the exact drop. I think probably because we were squeezed. I think it's as simple as that.
But why in so many seats there's been a drop of 2, 3, 4, even 5%?
Well, I think except for special constituencies where one obviously has particular results, either a very popular local member or a very unpopular local member, the swing is fairly uniform in this country, and obviously that's what's happened this time.
But you're now going to be the 4th party in the House of Commons. Isn't it in effect a disaster for the Liberals, this election?
No, I think it's obviously profoundly disappointing for the Liberal Party. But what I think for British democracy is much more disturbing than anything relating to the Liberal Party is that it is possible in this country for millions of people to vote for a responsible party with policies that have been widely acclaimed as being realistic and practical and be almost utterly deprived of representation in the House of Commons. And I think the other thing, which is also very disturbing, is that whether or not the Labour Party have an overall majority, one thing is quite certain, that they will be returned with a majority, and a large majority of the electorate opposed to them. Now, that is the product of our electoral system. And except for those who will unfairly have benefited from the system, it'll be very interesting the next few days to see who now is prepared to defend an electoral system which can do this. It is an appalling system.
Do you think you fought the right campaign?
Well, I think it's far too early to say. Personally, I believe that we fought it on the economy. We were told that our policy was realistic from as far afield as The Economist and The Sun, The Mail, The Guardian, The Times, The Financial Times. I have no doubt that we put forward a highly relevant and realistic policy on inflation, much of which the next government will have to adopt and implement in the next few months anyway.
What do you think the future of the Liberal Party is now after these results?
Well, the future of the Liberal Party I have been able to see because I've been around about 100 constituencies, and they are a very tough body of men and women. The Liberal
but isn't
Party.
there a danger that...
Well, you're asking me a question, and
Sorry.
being courteous, I'm trying to answer it, and I'm sure you'll let me complete my sentence. Having been around at least 100, 112 constituencies, I've seen Liberals who've been through far worse times in the 50s and the 60s. They'll get dug in. We are here to stay as a third force, and the only question is how many millions we will get and how few seats we will have to reflect it. And that, I think, is something which the British people, who are basically fair-minded, are coming to realise is a travesty of electoral justice, and the system has got to be changed, and it must be changed.
But in effect, haven't the Liberals, by this election result, put the clock back to 1964 for you?
No, I don't think so at all. I think we've fought constituencies that haven't been fought for years. We've built up organisations. You will see that our vote will be enormously larger than 64. It'll be in millions. And it's this extraordinary thing. I mean, you poll 18% and you may get only a dozen seats. You put it up to 25% and you'll get 200 seats. I mean, it's a crazy system. No other country in Western Europe would stand it for a minute. I should be very interested to hear the Tory party defending it now when they will be in opposition with the majority of the electorate opposed to the government that will take over.
How are you going to renew all the energy and enthusiasm and cash to reverse the
Well, I
trend
shall
of the
take
next
about
election?
2 days resting, and then my batteries will be fully recharged. And then I shall be in touch with all the regions and all the candidates, and I don't think you'll need bother too much about the Liberal Party's future. We're not going to allow ourselves to be written off.
You don't accept at all that it's a disaster for you?
I think it's very disappointing indeed, and I shall now say that to the press conference which I'm going to give, which, alas, is why I have to take my leave and go.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thorpe.
Just the other side of it.
And news from Mr. Thorpe on his way to that press conference. Montgomery has been held by the Liberal, Mr. Emlyn Hooson. Well, it would be a surprise if Mr. Hooson hadn't there in his Welsh fastnesses, but still encouraging for Mr. Thorpe. David?
Our projection is that the Liberals will in fact get 5.25 million, give or take a few votes, when the thing's in, and the Labour Party will be about 1 million votes ahead of the Conservatives. I think it is not quite clear, as David Lomax suggested, the Liberals will be the fourth party. It's absolutely nip and tuck whether the Liberals or the Scottish Nationalists have the larger number of seats. They're both going to be between 10 and 15, I'm virtually certain.
But Mr. Thorpe's argument, of course, is the millions of votes that he has, and which he has again obviously indicated what his next campaign is going to be.
Well, he's going to have 4 times as many votes as the Scottish Nationalists, yes.
Well, at this stage now, just coming up to midday, and with news that Derbyshire South East is having a recount, let's just confirm that our prediction is still that Mr. Wilson will have a narrow overall majority. Labour, 320, we're saying. The Conservatives, 276. Liberals, 12. And Labour, an overall majority of 5 seats. And whether that's good news for Mr. Wilson, as some people say, or bad news for Mr. Wilson, as some people say, or just bad news for the Conservatives, the next few months will show. And now, Robin Day. Robin, I think you are talking to Campbell Adamson, who is the Director General of the CBI.
Good morning, Mr. Adamson.
Good morning, Mr. Day.
Nobody can blame you for the election result this time, can they?
Or I hope last time.
But some people did.
Maybe.
What do you think is the action needed now by this government?
Oh, I think I'm quite sure what the action is needed. First of all, altogether, it's the fight against inflation. And the immediate necessity is to get industry out of the appalling cash squeeze, the appalling low profitability that it's in, because it's the only thing that can make our prosperity right again.
What are the measures necessary to do that?
Well, I think there are 2 very obvious ones. First of all, we shall have to look, any government will have to look at the prices code. Companies are being squeezed right down. They cannot charge the prices which will allow them to make sufficient profits, even to keep their businesses going very often, let alone invest.
What's this going to do to the prospect of wage restraint under the social contract?
I think the 2 things are quite different. Obviously, we've got to talk too about incomes restraint. But unless we can get a reasonable price code, this is not selfishness, one's talking facts now. Unless we can get a reasonable price code, there aren't going to be any jobs, because companies aren't going to be able to afford to employ the same number of people. So this is a must.
Isn't this result a narrow working majority for Labour? Isn't this result what a good number of businessmen who might normally be Conservative supporters wanted to see, on the grounds that they thought a Labour government with opposition support for crisis measures would be in a better position than a Conservative government who was going to be up against an opposition and trade union trouble?
Well, I wouldn't know about that, but what
You've heard that view expressed, have you not?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so particularly, but then one is busy with industry's affairs rather than seeing what happens here in that sense. But what I would like to say is that what many businessmen will feel is that with a majority that looks as if it's going to be as small as Mr. Wilson has, it'll put paid, one hopes, to the old-fashioned nonsense and unpopular doctrines of intervention in industry and nationalisation, which have failed so many times because of government interference that we don't want it again.
While the CBI would not have a view on this, do you think that industry as a whole would welcome Mr. Benn's translation to a different post in government than industry?
What industry will welcome most of all, Mr. Day, wherever Mr. Benn is is that it's allowed to carry on its own affairs. It is not taxed on fictitious profits, which have arisen purely through inflation, that it is allowed to charge prices which are fair to the consumer and gives the company a return which allows it to keep on employing its people and keep on building Britain a prosperous country. That's what we want.
Mr. Adamson, thank you very much. Alistair?
We don't yet know the reason for the recount in Derbyshire South East. It is, of course, one which could tip into the Labour column if there were a real swing there.
It's the sixth most marginal seat.
Michael, what are you looking for now?
We're looking at 5 seats where the Labour Party could still gain a seat now. The computer prediction of an overall Labour majority of 5 assumes that Labour will gain 1 of these seats. Now, I don't think any of these are individually likely to go Labour. Bosworth is perhaps the most likely on the swing. Derbyshire South East least likely on the swing. The recount may, in fact, of course, be for a Liberal lost deposit. There's one other, a right outside chance, Monmouth, on a high swing in Cardiff next door. It's just possible Labour will gain Monmouth. But if Labour doesn't gain any of those 5, its overall majority is 3, not 5. Now, Labour also could lose another seat today. Back on March the 1st, John Mackintosh lost Berwick and East Lothian on the second day, and there are just a few Labour seats which could be at risk today. Gloucestershire West, Brecon and Radnor, Caithness and Sutherland. I would bet Labour would hold each of these 3 seats, but they're the sort of seats which could go maverick like Berwick and East Lothian last time. If Labour didn't gain any of those 5 Tory seats and lost one of these, their overall majority is just 1.
Yeah, and of course, Caithness and Sutherland there is the last remaining Labour seat up in the north of Scotland. And so we won't be hearing from that one for a little while. It's a seat which, of course, has become more Labour under Robert McLennan, and incidentally, the existence of the Atomic Energy Centre there has been important. So while we still wait for these vital seats to come in, we know that Mr. Wilson is watching too. And the state of the parties, Labour at the moment 298 seats, a net gain of 18, Conservatives 198, a net loss of 20, Liberals 7 seats, a net loss of 1 so far. So let's pick up some of the results. Here's Montgomery, that's Emlyn Hewson's stronghold.
The only seat that's been Liberal all this century. His majority drops about 800, still safe Liberal.
And note that Plaid Cymru lost its deposit, David.
A slight increase in its vote, though. It's never been good Plaid Cymru territory.
Eastbourne in Gow. This is a seat the Liberals had hoped to win under Stephen Tyrrell.
Sensational drop in the Liberal vote there, down 13%. It may be significant that, as in Liverpool, there's a Liberal-controlled council.
And here's St Helens, a very safe Labour seat indeed.
The Liberals drop back into 3rd place.
And now some of the big mining seats coming in, like the Rother Valley. Nothing much you can do about a majority like that if you're not a Labour member. Now Easington, this is Manny Shinwell's old seat, and the one that he took off Ramsay MacDonald many years ago. Still a huge Labour majority.
On the mining seats last night, there were 3% swings, so those two are low.
And there's Mr. Dormand, the successor to Mr. Emmanuel Shinwell at Easington. We are going to get now a large number of these big mining seats coming in, counting on the second day. Rural mining constituencies.
About 15
I think we have now got a declaration coming at Buckingham, a rather bitterly fought seat between Bill Benyon, the Conservative, and Robert Maxwell, Labour. Writs flying about there. We'd better keep our comments rather moderate. Let's go there, see if they've got a result. Bernard Falk is at Buckingham, but we don't seem to be hearing from him. This, as I was saying, is one of those seats which Labour would like to pick up if they can, and of course Captain Maxwell, a controversial figure in industry and in other ways, never short of a pungent word. He's fighting it still this time.
It's the 4th most marginal seat still to come in.
So there'll be a lot of fingers crossed here. One of the reasons why people were getting a bit fed up there was, of course, the controversy over the possible closure of the car works at Newport Pagnell, where a number of the constituents live, and I think Mr. Benyon is in some trouble there with the owners of the car factory. So this is certainly one where there's been, I think we can safely say, without being sued ourselves, a little bit of bad blood. News that at Henley, down there, and that, of course, is Mr. Michael Heseltine's seat. He has held that one safely. Mr. Heseltine has come up closer to London from the West Country, where he used to sit. Well, we don't know quite what got stuck in the works at Buckingham. No doubt it will be cleared in just a few moments.
You see that Labour is now only 99 seats ahead of the Conservatives. Their seats are beginning to come in fast now, and that huge gap, which was artificial because of the seats that count on the night and count on the next day, is beginning to close up. And it will close up quite fast the next hour.
Bob, you have a comment.
Well, this election has not been good news for women's Lib. It looks as if they're going to have about exactly the same number of seats, the women, they had in 1945. That is, 30 years on, women are standing still in terms of membership of the House of Commons, 20, 21, 22, 23, and that is really, in a way, rather sad for the female half of the population.
Well, the question there is, of course, to get the women adopted by the local parties, isn't it? It's not so much that the voters won't vote for women. I don't think we've got any serious evidence of that, because women, of course, do come into the House of Commons, and we've seen Janet Fuchs holding on in a very marginal seat there. But it is the local parties, isn't it? They do seem still to prefer men. Even the women on the local parties seem to prefer the men.
Yes, it's curious, really, because the women are making breakthroughs even into television, where they're allowed now to perform for the first time, really, in... since the war.
They're of course creeping into some of the clubs along Pall Mall. Who knows, they may even get into politics. Well, now we saw, just a little while ago, Mr. Whitelaw's result at Penrith, and now Robin Day is talking to him.
Good morning, Mr. Whitelaw.
Good morning, Robin.
Your majority, if I may remind you, dropped from 17,000 or so to 13,000 and something. That wasn't very good, was it?
Well, it was still a very remarkable majority, and it's the same sort of majority as I had in 1970 and I think in 1959. I think my people did a remarkable job, and I'm very grateful for the overwhelming support I've achieved.
Of course, you couldn't be there as often as you would like, could you, because of your role as chairman of the party and talking to us in the press in London a lot?
Well, I suppose there was something in that, but still, I'm very pleased with the result. My wife did an enormous amount of work in the constituency. I managed to get round a great deal as well, and I think I'm very grateful to all my supporters, and I must say, it is a very good result for us indeed.
It looks a little different now, the picture, than when I talked to you last night, just after the BBC poll had suggested talk of a majority of about 100 for Labour, doesn't it?
Yes, it does indeed.
And don't you think that you could have won it if the campaign had been just that bit better?
I think we fought a very good campaign. For this reason, that we told the people the truth as we believed it to be, the truth about the serious situation facing our country. Now, if one tells the truth comes out, and it stands you in good stead in the long run, and I believe it will stand our party in very good stead in the months ahead.
Would I be right to think that talk of Mr. Heath moving out of the leadership is now very unrealistic?
I would hope that that was certainly so. There's never been any talk, as far as I'm concerned, as far as many members of the party are concerned. Of course, there has been speculation, but I think everyone knows my position very well.
We had an interview with Mr. Thorpe just now, and he said he was going to be very interested to see what the Tories in opposition would have to say about an electoral system under which 5.25 million Liberals get only about 10 or a dozen seats in the House of Commons. Now, Mr. Whitelaw, do you think that is fair? And bearing in mind that we've got a majority Labour government with a tiny minority of 5, yet with nearly 60% of the votes not cast in favour of them.
Well, we did say in our manifesto, and we said throughout the election, that we were prepared to have the whole situation examined by a Speaker's Conference, the proper way. That is still our position. We would be ready for that. But no party could commit its members of Parliament in the House of Commons in advance of hearing what that Speaker's Conference said. And if I may say so, it would be very wise to consider it. As you know, I had some experience of proportional representation when I was in Northern Ireland. And there are a great many different systems, and they all have to be studied, and I think we ought to, all of us, to be wise to wait the result of a Speaker's Conference.
But do you think the system which Mr. Thorpe was criticising is fair?
Well, I think the best answer, I know some people think that it isn't. What I think we've got to do is to have a Speaker's Conference who will consider the system as it is and all the alternatives, and then we can all make up our minds in Parliament, and the country can see exactly what an impartial body considers about our system and whether we might change it.
But do you think it is fair, Mr. Whitelaw?
It has been, I think, on balance, it has
serve this country very well. It can be argued sometimes it isn't fair. What I think we have to decide and look at, and that's what a Speaker's Conference would do, is would any other system be fairer or better? That's the question, and I think that is the question the Speaker's Conference must answer.
Could I point out to you that the Conservatives have held Buckingham and that Mr. Robert Maxwell did not get in?
Well, there we are. I never make any personal remarks, but I went to Buckingham and I had a very good meeting there, and so I shall just bask in a little reflected glory, and I'm very pleased they've held it.
Well, we enjoy the sight of your face when you bask in reflected glory, because you're not normally an immodest man, Mr. Whitelaw. Thank you very much.
Jolly good, Robin. Thank you very much.
Personal remarks. Well, of course, that news about Buckingham is indeed important politically under the existing electoral system. Here is the result of Bill Benyon holding the seat.
This was the fourth most marginal seat still to come. It's quite safely in the Conservative column. Actually, no swing at all. There have only been 6 seats swinging the other way to the Conservatives. This is an impressive result. The Liberals go down, the Conservatives and the Labour Party gain equally from the 3% drop in the Liberal vote. We also saw a flash that Hitchin had been held, and that was the next most marginal after Buckingham that we hadn't heard from. I think there are only 4 seats which could conceivably go Labour still to come in. And so if none of them go Labour, we are down to a 3-seat clear majority.
Well, of course, Bob would say that that wasn't Women's Lib working out, because Anne Malalieu, very popular young Labour personality on television, has failed to get that particular seat. Well, anyway, we can now leave Buckingham, and I think going now to Mr. Thorpe's press conference at North Devon.
Campaign by the
Well,
Liberals.
obviously we have. That's why
coverage.
we're all talking about it being a very disappointing election to the Liberals. I don't think I need to have to point that out to you. You pointed out to me. We've gone down 2 and 3%, certainly in these places. But why state the obvious? I've admitted it.
I'm asking the question, why?
I don't know. I'm going to analyse. I shall find out. I shall find out fairly soon.
Back on the campaign.
What's that?
If I may ask, looking back on the campaign, what do you think the most successful campaigning point you've made was?
I think that what to me is enormously satisfying is the wrong word. What I think is gratifying is that on the Wednesday, that is the day before polling day, one could pick up the newspapers and read the leading articles of the Times, the Guardian, the Sun, and the Mail, all of whom said the Liberals, and I'm paraphrasing, have been honest, they have been realistic, they have put forward policies on inflation which make sense. And that was a pretty diverse range of opinion. And I believe that intellectually we were right, and I have no regrets about the way in which we fought the campaign on the questions of inflation and the policies which we put forward. Many of those policies will be, in fact, be implemented. Whether a Labour government will be able to stand the strains internally of having to have a statutory prices and incomes policy is another imponderable, which we shall probably have cause to judge in the next few months.
But in purely party political terms, you've laid great emphasis on the poster that's in this hall here.
I personally don't think so. I believe that we fought the right campaign.
Mr. Wilson's home, his private home in London, just round the corner from the House of Commons and just a short step away from Downing Street. So Mr. Wilson, Mrs. Wilson and the entourage have got home from their flight from Liverpool. We saw them at London Airport, and here, standing as we have to at the back of the crowd, and Mr. Wilson back home. And he's not going, there's Lady Falkender just coming into the picture, his personal political secretary, and there's no doubt that Mr. Wilson has got a busy time in front of him, but he does intend, as he was saying earlier on, to try to have a little bit of a rest, standing at the doorway with Mrs. Wilson. And he will be going along to Transport House, we understand, later today, and also to number 10 itself, which is now his office rather than his home. Well, we had to cut away from Mr. Thorpe there to see Mr. Wilson. Let's go back to Mr. Thorpe's press conference, which is being conducted down the line to North Devon.
Scotland, but because they were attracted in some ways by the possibly social democratic platform put forward by the SNP.
If you believe that, you can believe anything.
I mean, that's what the SNP say.
They're not the most objective critics of their own policies. First of all, I don't intend to make a detailed comment about Scotland because I haven't all the facts and all the figures. But all I would tell you is that if you believe that the SNP is a social democratic party, You and I have very strangely differing interpretations of that particular matter, and I think there we must agree to differ.
Well, it's what they're claiming rather than what I believe.
Well, I know, but we've also heard the Labour Party claim that they're a moderate and that Mr. Heath is in favour of unity, and lots of people claim all sorts of things. That doesn't mean to say we necessarily have to accept what everyone says at their face value.
Do you think then that going off Scotland, off the Liberal Party generally, do you think that you have lost out in any way by not making your position on a coalition perhaps clearer than it was?
No, I think we made it perfectly plain and perfectly clear.
Two third parties which did make advances were both anti-community while you were pro-community.
No, I think I should have thought that, if I may say so with respect, the reason is so obvious that it hardly has to be pointed out, that they were not great United Kingdom parties with their support evenly spread over 600 constituencies. They were concentrated in relatively few constituencies. If the Liberal Party was also a Cornish Home Rule movement, we'd probably taken all 5 seats. This is the thing, that if you are concentrated, as are the Ulster Unionists and Plaid Cymru and SNP in a particular region, your concentration of votes will give you a lot of seats. If you are evenly spread as a great United Kingdom of federal party as we are, then you immediately suffer. I mean, if we were simply a Yorkshire protest movement, we'd probably pick up all seats in Yorkshire. We're not. We're a national party. That's what makes the system so crazy.
You think it was wrong not to concentrate
well,
on
for the vanquished, and in a sense Mr. Thorpe and the Liberals have been vanquished, at least of their highest hopes in this election, there is always the post-mortem. Mr. Thorpe being hunted by the press there at the press conference which he dominated so successfully back in February when he was making his major gains. Bob, you've a view about
the slightly bitter tone at one or two stages is understandable. Mr. Thorpe got roughly half as many votes as the Conservatives and 45% as many votes, if you like, as the Labour Party, and yet he's going to end up with 12 seats against the previous 14, so there is a ground for that. I think he didn't hear, couldn't have heard, the earlier interview with Mr. Whitelaw, and I thought it very interesting that he renewed the proposal in this post-election situation for a Speaker's Conference to look at various reforms of the electoral system, and whether Labour will want to play along with that, we don't know, but he's keeping it to the fore still, and to some extent accepting the argument that with 59% of the electorate voting for other than the Labour Party, there's a case for looking at the electoral system.
Well, Mr. Thorpe was referring to a number of newspaper editorials on the eve of the election and beforehand, in which, of course, proportional representation was one of the bases of such a coalition between the Conservatives and the Liberals.
Indeed, The Economist did bring this out very interestingly.
Well, now, the Conservatives, of course, did not take that up, rightly or wrongly, and I'm no longer responsible for The Economist, so you can speak freely, Bob. But, in fact, do you think this is seriously practical politics at this moment?
Well, not at this moment, obviously, but I do think there's still a strong current, as The Economist pointed out, in favour of...
That's another £5.
Just because you've left it, you were saying I was the one advocating it. The Economist advocated that we adopt proportional representation while you were still editor.
Well, there's always for a favourable mention, of course, I identify you as Robert Mackenzie and you get the £5 prize. Anyhow, let's get some more results. Here's Chipping Barnet, Mr. Reginald Maudling back again.
Exactly the same pattern as these seats all around London. Lowish swing, Labour up, Liberals down.
And now another Conservative personality, Mr. Heseltine. He fought a very strong fight right through the summer against nationalisation.
Liberals still second, but down 4%.
And now in Petersfield, here's the successor, Lieutenant Colonel Mates from Joan Quennell.
And Liberals only slightly down there, less than 1%. Conservatives dropped more than the Liberals there.
And here's one of the stalwarts of the 1922 committee, Sir Derek Walker-Smith, much opposed to Europe in the past, but a constitutionalist, and maybe even getting to like Europe one day.
One of the few survivors from of the Conservative side from 1945.
And now here's Eric Varley, of course. He's very big in the energy game for the Labour Party, and back in his seat at Chesterfield.
Big swing in a mining seat.
And Conservatives holding Ludlow. Let's have a little look at that Buckingham result. Bill Benyon succeeded in defeating Robert Maxwell with no swing whatsoever on that result. Now, Bernard Falk at Buckingham is talking to Robert Maxwell.
Mr. Maxwell, your immediate reaction? Disappointed that, unlike in 1964, when we won this constituency against the national swing, that this time Buckingham will not add the additional vote that Mr. Wilson so urgently needs in order to have an effective majority to enable him to carry out the measures to put our country on the road to recovery.
What were the issues that you fought this particular campaign in this constituency on?
National policies.
Why do you think you came so near again, but in fact didn't win?
Well, that's how the cookie crumbles. In this part of the country, the swing and Tory-held marginals hardly operated at all.
Do you intend to stay in politics now? Because this is the third election that you've
Yes,
actually been
I
defeated.
have won it twice and lost it 3 times. I certainly intend to stay in politics. Whether I will stay in Buckingham, I doubt it very much. It's time somebody else had a chance at it, but that'll be up to the party.
Mr. Maxwell, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And of course there's a recount in South East Derby.
So Captain Maxwell appearing there to be ready to stand down for somebody else in Buckingham in the Labour interest. We saw Eldon Griffiths, another Conservative personality, returned for Bury St Edmunds while that was going on. And we have some more results. These up from the northeast, all very safe Labour seats: Bishop Auckland, Blaydon and Wallsend.
And all well above average swings, as we have been having in predominantly mining seats.
So we saw there Mr. Eric Varley's return at Chesterfield, and this seems an appropriate time with so many of Britain's fortunes ahead, seemingly based upon the North Sea, but controversy about what should be done. We have in the studio with Robin Lord Balog, we have Mr. Joe Gormley of the Mine Workers Union, I think Mr. Christopher Tugendhat, who has returned for cities of London and Westminster South. And I hope that we have available in Edinburgh the Junior Minister for Energy, Mr. Gavin Strang. Robin?
Thank you, Alistair. Lord Balog, may I ask you first of all, what is the position about coal stocks this winter?
I think that the Prime Minister and Mr. Varley has given assurances, having talked to both the mining unions executive and also to the coal board.
Aren't they much lower than they should normally be at this time of year?
It would be very nice if they were higher, but I mean, I think that they will be adequate.
Do you regret the attitude of the Mine Workers Union to the coal board productivity deal?
We haven't yet seen the last of it, and I think that Mr. Gormley will be able to enlighten us.
Enlighten us, please, Joe Gormley.
Well, I don't know what we're really talking about. We're still in
You don't know
discussion.
what?
We don't know. I don't know what you're really talking about because.
Have we got enough coal, and why aren't the miners agreeing to the
I think we have enough
productivity
coal to
deal?
last a winter that's a normal winter, or any type of a winter. It just depends. If you get a yard of snow, there'll be difficulty moving coal about. But I think in a normal winter period, we have sufficient stocks to see us through.
Nobody's mentioned any figures.
Well, there are still stocks sufficient, as I say, to carry us through. If people want to have excessive stocks for some other reason, then that's their opinion. But I believe we have sufficient stocks in Britain to carry us through the winter period.
Christopher,
And there has been...
do you agree with that?
Well, I think that both Lord Balloch and Joe Gormley are really saying, only they're wrapping it up a great deal, that the stock situation is worrying. Obviously, if there isn't a miners' dispute, and if the winter is very mild and so forth, we'll be all right. But if there is a miners' dispute, or if there's a bad winter, we could be in a difficult situation.
What do you say? After all, you see, Mr. Heath is not in the government, so that there might be less difficulty with the miners.
What do you comment you make, Joe Gormley, on the comment by a member of your union opposing the fact that there isn't going to be a ballot on the productivity deal?
There will be a ballot on the productivity deal. That's a guarantee. We've never said which sort of a productivity deal we'll put to the members, but at some time there will be something put before the members. What has happened is that the executive have changed their mind since July, when they asked us to negotiate, but not needing to be tied to a national productivity agreement. Now they decided that we must be tied to a productivity agreement, and we're in discussion with the board on that issue. We've got to get the board reaction to a position we put to them last week. But I still indicate that the position of the union is that we want a productivity deal, but whether we get a productivity deal or not, we are intent to make sure that we get to the targets which we said to the government we would get for the industry this year.
Can I just intervene in this discussion to draw your attention to the flash on the screen that the Liberals hold the Isle of Ely, Mr. Clement Freud. Can Can I go back to you, Christopher Tugendhat? Thank you, Joe. I didn't wish to interrupt. Mr. Tugendhat, you know quite a lot about oil, don't you? What do you think are the possibilities of getting the oil problem and the financing of oil and all that business right? Because Mr. Harold Lever was saying on the eve of poll, and repeated it last night, that whatever a Labour government may be able to do at home, everything will have a devastating crisis, was his words, on our standard of living if we don't get proper international cooperation. What do you see as the hopes for this?
I think that Mr. Harold Lever has made a very substantial contribution to thought in these matters, but the problems are terribly difficult, and I think that it probably is no more than 50-50 that we're going to come up with some kind of viable solution. When people say that very little has been done over the last year, I think they tend to look too much on the black side, because this is a very novel problem. We've never had to deal with anything like it before. I think the International Monetary Fund has made advances. I think the banks have, in fact, handled this rather better than one might have expected. But we have now reached the point where the banking system simply cannot handle the sums of money that are involved. And this, I think, will at last bring the kind of intellectual pressure to bear on those who have the funds, namely the Arabs, to look more favourably at some of the ideas that have been put up from the West. I entirely agree with Harold Lever that if we don't get this right, it hardly matters what government we have in this country. There'll be a terrible mess anyway.
Paul Bellogg, as Minister of State in the Energy Department, can you help us on the prospects in this essential problem?
Well, there are two problems, you see, which you mentioned. There is the immediate problem for the next 2 or 3 years. This is a world problem. We are importers. And after 2 or 3 years, I mean, it depends a little bit on technical difficulties. We have seen there have been technical difficulties not only in our case, but also in the Norwegian case. After 2 years, we ought to be reasonably free of all worry. Now, Mr. Whitelaw said, you see, that the campaign was fought on truth. This, I'm afraid, is not the case so far as the British oil problem is concerned, because both Mr. Howell and Patrick Jenkins raised blue herrings by the dozen, and we were completely occupied in refuting it. The situation is that there has been no difficulty about financing. There has been no sort of guarantee or indemnity given to the oil companies. Everything is going very well in that. There are obviously slippages, but we are working at the very end of the technical possibilities, and you expect difficulties. I mean, everybody, including the Americans, had very great difficulties with atomic power.
Would you agree, though, that whatever the North Sea oil prospects, and no matter how well these matters may be going, we do have an urgent need for as much coal as the miners are able to give us by the most efficient means?
Oh, of course.
Joe Gormley?
Well, I can guarantee the miners are fully aware of the situation. I wish people would realise and read what we've been saying for 20 years, that Britain should be as self-reliant as possible on for its sources of energy. We've been saying this for 15 years. Now the things are coming home to roost. And then somebody turns around to the miners and say that you are responsible for all the things that are wrong. Well, I don't accept that. But what we do say...
I don't think anyone has actually said that, have they?
Pardon?
I don't think anyone has actually said that.
Well, they have been saying this in many quarters, and I don't accept any of that. All I say is that the miners have a part to play in the success and the failure of Britain. They have to live in Britain.
Final comment from you, Christopher Tugendhat. You were one among two here.
What Lord Balloch overlooks is the fact that the really difficult period will be the next 2 or 3 years. These slippages he talks about in the North Sea are very important, because if we don't get large quantities of oil as soon as possible, then the really difficult period which we face will be extended. And that is why it is important not to blur over the problems, but to take them terribly, terribly seriously.
We shall certainly do that.
And now that discussion, foreshadowing some of the problems of the winter and the future. A lot of interesting results have been coming through our computer.